Millionaire sees his childhood love begging with a baby. His eyes fill with tears as he recognizes her. Seconds later, he makes a decision that shocks everyone. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Scott Morris had grown used to the hum of city traffic beneath the tinted windows of his black Mercedes-Benz. He was 37 years old, an accomplished CEO who had built a multi-million-dollar tech empire in Manhattan. That afternoon, a cold wind lashed at the towering buildings along Fifth Avenue, turning every breath of air into a white puff of condensation. Scott loosened his silk tie, feeling the dry heat from the car's vents against his face. The winter chill outside seemed unforgiving, but nothing in his life, up to that moment, had prepared him for what he was about to see. As the vehicle rolled to a stop at a red light, Scott glanced out the side window. It was a casual move, the kind people make when bored in traffic, but instead of seeing the usual rush of business people in tailored coats or tourists snapping photographs, he spotted a young woman cradling a small baby against her chest. Her hair, dark and tangled, partially covered her face. She extended a paper cup toward the passing crowd, hoping for spare change. For a moment, Scott thought she looked vaguely familiar, yet it was the baby's faint cry that really caught his attention first. The infant's tiny whimper carried a kind of desperation that made Scott shift in his seat. He leaned closer to the window, nearly pressing his forehead against the glass. The woman turned her gaze toward him, and in that instant he felt a jolt like an electric shock. Those eyes, though weary and worn, were the same deep brown ones he had memorized 2 decades ago in the Bronx. Elena, his heart pounded, and the noise of the traffic seemed to fade into the background. Elena Martinez had been his first love when he was just a skinny kid of 17, long before big contracts and expensive suits. Back then, they lived in a cramped neighborhood where kids played stickball in the streets and families struggled to pay rent on time. He remembered her laughter, how it would ring out in the humid Bronx summers. He remembered the tearful day she vanished after her family was deported to Mexico, and he remembered the vow he had made to himself. He would rise so high that he'd never again be powerless to stop such unfairness. Yet here he was, safe behind the glossy armor of his Mercedes, while she stood exposed to the bitter cold, begging with a baby in her arms. Elena was 35 now, 2 years younger than Scott, and the lines of worry etched into her face told a tale of hardship he could only guess at. His mind whirled with questions. How had she ended up on Fifth Avenue, of all places, asking strangers for change? And who was the baby? Why was Elena alone? He reached for the door handle impulsively, ready to leap out onto the sidewalk, but the traffic light turned green. The driver, unaware of Scott's turmoil, pressed the accelerator. The car jerked forward, and Scott's hand slipped away from the latch. He craned his neck, trying to keep Elena in sight, but within seconds she was lost among the bustling throng of pedestrians. A wave of guilt and helplessness washed over him, stirring a tight knot in his stomach. In the seat beside him lay his leather briefcase, stuffed with documents about a major deal with an overseas investor. A sharp contrast, he thought, to Elena's paper cup. He noticed how his reflection in the window showed not just surprise, but something deeper, pain, perhaps. Memories he had shoved aside for years came flooding back. He recalled how he and Elena would share their dreams under flickering streetlights. She wanted to become an English teacher. He wanted to change the world through technology. Then one day he found her home empty, the front door sealed with a deportation notice. He never even had the chance to say goodbye. His phone buzzed with a reminder about an upcoming shareholders meeting. At the same time, his mind kept replaying the sight of Elena's face, A swirl of conflicting emotions took hold: fear, longing, shame. The fear that she might vanish again, the longing to help her, and the shame of having all this wealth yet feeling useless in that moment. By the time the Mercedes reached his office tower, Scott felt a chill that had nothing to do with winter air. He stepped onto the polished marble floor of the lobby, forcing a cordial nod at the doorman who greeted him. Yet, in his thoughts, he was standing on that sidewalk, looking into Elena's tired eyes. Up in his executive suite, he stared out the window that overlooked Manhattan's skyline. The city below shimmered with ambition and power. Somewhere out there, Elena struggled, a baby clutched in her arms, and for the first time in a long while, Scott felt truly powerless. No multi-million-dollar enterprise or string of Ivy League connections could erase that moment of recognition on Fifth Avenue. He thought he'd buried the past. He was wrong. And as he sank into his ergonomic chair, Scott realized one undeniable truth. Everything in his carefully constructed life had just changed with a single, heartbreaking glance. The morning after that haunting encounter, Scott arrived at his corner office earlier than usual. The city was still waking up, and a layer of fresh snow blanketed the sidewalks. He dropped his overcoat on a sleek leather couch, trying to shake off the chill. A jam-packed schedule awaited him: meetings, phone calls, and a lunch with an investor from Japan, yet his mind was nowhere near business strategy. He sank behind his mahogany desk, scrolling through his email inbox without much focus. Midway through, a particular subject line caught his attention: support for immigrant mothers. Urgent request. It came from the New Beginnings Foundation, a local non-profit he'd quietly donated to once before. Normally, he would forward such emails to his assistant, but something compelled him to open it immediately. The message, penned by a woman named Diane Brooks, explained that the foundation had recently encountered a surge in immigrant women fleeing abusive relationships. Some were living on the streets with infants, battling both the weather and a labyrinth of legal red tape. The note hinted at tragic stories: families torn apart, children lost in the system, and unscrupulous officials taking advantage of their vulnerability. Diane pleaded for financial help to expand a shelter and cover legal representation for several cases on the brink of collapse. Reading about women who resembled Elena in such dire straits made Scott's chest tighten. Though the email didn't specifically name her, the scenario mirrored what he'd witnessed the day before. It felt uncanny, almost as if fate had arrived in his inbox, confronting him with a responsibility he wasn't sure he was ready to bear. He was so absorbed in the words on his screen that he barely noticed Penelope entering the room. She was dressed impeccably, as always, in a fitted navy blazer and heels that clicked elegantly against the floor. Penelope, 32 years old, had come from a wealthy Connecticut family, and her relationship with Scott was as much about social alignment as it was about any real affection. "Good morning," she said, though her tone was more curious than warm. "You look troubled. Everything all right?" Scott minimized the email. "I'm fine, just a lot on my mind. The usual business stuff." She leaned against the corner of his desk, eyeing him with a hint of skepticism. "Well, let me guess. The big product launch has everyone on edge. Or is it that lunch with Mr. Kobayashi? You always get restless when deals are at stake." She smoothed a strand of her perfectly styled hair. "By the way, my mother needs a head count for our engagement party next month. Have you finalized who's coming from your side?" He sighed. The mention of their engagement party reminded him how detached he felt from that future. "Not yet. I'll handle it soon." Penelope pursed her lips. "Scott, is there something else going on? You've seemed distracted since yesterday." He considered telling her about Elena, but hesitated. Penelope was practical and not prone to sympathy for strangers. She cared about appearances, about what the tabloids might say, and about how anything might affect her social standing. The brief mental image of her reaction to a story about an ex-girlfriend begging on Fifth Avenue froze his words. "Just tired," he replied finally. "I'll be okay." Penelope gave him a concerned look, but didn't press further. She walked to the door, pausing to remind him of the day's commitments before disappearing into the hallway. Exhaling, Scott reopened the email from Diane Brooks. He clicked on a link that led to the Foundation's website. The pictures showed cramped sleeping quarters in a basement shelter shared by women and their children. It struck him that these were real, living people. They weren't just statistics in a news article. Before he could decide on a course of action, his phone rang. Marjorie, his mother, was calling. He hadn't spoken to her in a week. She lived comfortably in an apartment he'd purchased for her near Central Park, though she missed their old neighborhood sometimes. Marjorie was in her 60s, a resilient woman who had raised Scott on her own after his father passed away. "Hey, Ma," he said softly. Her voice came through with a familiar warmth. "You sound worried, son. Something on your mind?" He wondered if she had some sixth sense for his troubles. "I'm all right, just business. You never were a good liar." "Let me guess, you're feeling that old itch to help someone in trouble." Scott swallowed, startled by how close she was to the truth. "It's complicated." Marjorie paused. "All important things are. Trust your heart, honey. That's one thing you've always had going for you." After hanging up, Scott stared at his reflection in the glossy desk surface. Memories of his teenage years with Elena floated to the forefront of his mind, the promise he'd made to himself that he would never be helpless again. Now, with a single email and the memory of Elena on Fifth Avenue, his safe, ordered life was starting to feel fragile. He realized that sometimes the greatest disruptions begin with a subtle sign, like an email titled "Urgent Request." That afternoon, Scott found himself in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the bustling streets of Midtown Manhattan. Seated around the polished oval table were board members, department heads, and legal advisors. They were discussing a crucial product launch, a new data encryption platform that promised to revolutionize cybersecurity. Normally, Scott would be leading the conversation with clarity and assertiveness, but he kept glancing at the digital clock on the wall, lost in thought. His chief legal officer, Samuel Green, droned on about patent filings. But in Scott's mind, images of Elena holding her baby on the snowy sidewalk replayed like a grainy film clip. If she needed help, how could he stand idly by? "Scott," Samuel said, finally noticing his distraction. "We need your input on finalizing the trademark application. Could we confirm your approval?" Scott looked up, forcing himself to focus. "Yes, of course. I trust your judgment, Sam. Just proceed with the standard protocols." A concerned murmur spread around the table as the conversation moved on. Scott seldom brushed off important decisions with a simple, "I trust you." He'd built this company by being meticulously involved. Yet here he was, nodding through a meeting while his thoughts were miles away, searching for a woman he hadn't seen in 20 years. When the meeting ended, the board members left in a polite flurry of shuffling papers and hushed side conversations. Scott remained, staring out the window. The phone in his pocket buzzed, another reminder about tomorrow's investor call. Ignoring it, he walked to his private office, feeling an unshakable sense of unease. He closed the door and sank into the chair behind his desk. On an impulse, he opened a new browser tab and typed "New Beginnings Foundation." Before he could click on anything, there was a soft knock at the door. Penelope stepped inside, her expression carefully neutral. "Everything all right. Word around the office is that you seemed absent in the meeting." He exhaled slowly. I have something personal going on." Penelope took a seat across from him, crossing her legs with poised elegance. "You know you can tell me if it's serious," she said, though the tone held a hint of caution. She didn't like surprises, and Scott's current behavior was definitely off-pattern. He avoided her gaze, fiddling with the paperweight on his desk. "I just need to handle it in my own way." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "I know you, Scott. You're laser-focused on the business until you're not, and when you're not, it's usually because something else has your full attention." She leaned forward, lowering her voice as if to keep the conversation strictly between them. "Is it family-related? Because if it is, I can help manage the media or anything that might—" "It's not about media exposure," he interrupted, a bit sharper than he intended. He inhaled, steadying himself. "Look, I appreciate your concern, but trust me, I just need some space to figure things out." Penelope pursed her lips. "All right, but remember, our engagement party is in a few weeks. My mother is pressing me about final details. Please don't let whatever this is derail our preparations." He nodded, wanting the conversation to end. "I understand." Once she left, the room felt quieter than ever. Scott resumed his online search, scanning through the Foundation's website for any mention of newly arrived women who matched Elena's description. He found nothing concrete, only general information about their programs. Still, a persistent voice in his mind told him that connecting with Diane Brooks was his next step. Yet every time he was about to dial the number listed, a wave of hesitation washed over him. He wondered if Elena would even want his help. Maybe she blamed him somehow for not being there all those years, or perhaps she was too proud to accept money from an old flame. His chest tightened at the thought of finding her only for her to reject him outright. Then a memory surfaced. The last time he saw her smile, back when they were kids in the Bronx. They'd been sitting on a park bench, sharing a bag of potato chips. He had proudly told her of his dream to start a technology company someday. She teased him for being a big dreamer, and then assured him he had the courage to make it happen. Her faith in him had felt like an unspoken promise, one that suddenly mattered more than any contract or shareholder's expectation. But doubt hovered over him. The possibility that he could fail her yet again made him hesitate. Standing up, he paced near the floor-to-ceiling windows, hands in his pockets. The city lights were starting to shimmer, and the office was mostly empty, save for a few workaholics in distant cubicles. He hated feeling powerless. It was this exact powerlessness he had sworn to conquer when he left the Bronx. Now, with all his success, he wondered if he'd ever truly escaped it, if seeing Elena so vulnerable stirred his old sense of guilt, then refusing to act would only amplify it. But stepping in might tear down the carefully built facade of his life, exposing him to scandal or backlash from shareholders. He was stuck, torn between fear of entanglement and the nagging moral call that insisted he do something. As the evening sky darkened, Scott sank back into his chair, a heavy silence settling around him. There was no escaping this conflict, no easy path to choose. The heartache born from that snowy encounter refused to be ignored, lingering like a shadow in every thought. He closed his eyes, recalling Elena's anxious expression and the baby's soft cry. He knew that ignoring them now would haunt him forever. That night, Scott barely slept. He lay in his penthouse apartment, watching the moonlight stretch across the ceiling. The wind whistled against the glass windows, and the city's distant horns seemed relentless. Each time he closed his eyes, he pictured Elena's face in the winter cold, a stark reminder of how easily life can unravel. Before dawn, he finally rose, threw on a tracksuit, and headed to the building's private gym. Exercising often cleared his mind, but that morning, every step on the treadmill felt heavy. Images of Elena carrying her baby flashed through him like a persistent ache that no amount of effort could shake. By the time he arrived at the office, a wave of tension awaited him. Walter Gibson, a key investor in the company, was pacing the lobby, his sharp gaze scanning the modern decor. Walter was in his 50s, with iron-grey hair and a reputation for ruthless deal-making. "Scott," Walter said curtly when he spotted him, "we need to talk, immediately." They headed to Scott's office. Walter wasted no time voicing his concerns. "Rumor has it you've been distracted. Missing critical details in product development. Now, I don't like rumors, but we have a new wave of Asian investors on the fence about expanding their shares. If they sense a shaky CEO, we could lose them." Scott rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the mounting weight of these demands. "I'm aware of the stakes, Walter. I'm handling everything." Walter's eyes narrowed. "Are you? Because people are whispering that your mind is elsewhere. And we both know a single misstep in public relations can tank our stock." Scott stiffened, trying to keep his composure. "I appreciate your vigilance, but I have the situation under control." Walter paused, assessing him. "If you need time off or some personal leave, perhaps we can delegate certain responsibilities. I just need to ensure everything stays on track." His voice carried the faintest hint of threat, implying that if Scott faltered, the board would have no issue replacing him temporarily or permanently. Scott bristled but forced himself to smile politely. "I'm fine, Walter. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a conference call to join." Walter nodded, still looking skeptical, and left. The door closed, and the tension in the room was almost palpable. Leaning against his desk, Scott allowed himself a moment to breathe. He thought about how swiftly everything he'd built could slip from his grasp if he didn't keep the company stable. The question was whether he had the bandwidth to do that and help Elena too. Around midday, he received a phone call from his mother, Marjorie. "Honey, are you free for dinner tonight?" she asked. "I'm making your favorite pot roast." "I don't know if I can make it," Scott replied, voice subdued. "There's a lot going on right now." She sighed. "Too much going on for a home-cooked meal. You must be under tremendous stress. Is it about that big product launch, or is it something else?" Her gentle probing made his chest tighten. He considered telling her about Elena, but hesitated again. Instead, he said, "I'll try to stop by, Ma. I could use a break." "Good," she said simply. "Come around 7 and try not to work too late." After hanging up, he glanced at the clock. Only a few hours had passed since Walter's dressing down, yet it felt like days. He thumbed through a few messages, noticing another update from the New Beginnings Foundation. The email mentioned that an anonymous donor had funded part of their emergency shelter expansion, but they were still seeking additional resources for legal representation. The fact that he'd even opened these emails was unusual for him. Typically, he relied on staff to handle philanthropic inquiries, yet he found himself rereading the lines, searching for something, maybe a mention of Elena's name, or a case that matched her situation. A sudden wave of questions surfaced. What if he tried to track her down personally? He had the money to hire a private investigator, but would that be too intrusive? Elena had her reasons for hiding, no doubt. The fear in her eyes on the sidewalk made it clear she was running from something or someone. The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls and rushed meetings. By the time 6 o'clock rolled around, Scott felt mentally drained. He left the office and navigated through the congested streets toward his mother's apartment. Her building was modest compared to his own, but he felt a sense of relief stepping into the cozy lobby, greeted by a doorman who actually knew his name. The aroma of pot roast enveloped him the moment he entered Marjorie's place. The living room walls were adorned with family photos, pictures of a younger Scott grinning proudly at his high school graduation, next to one of him looking stiff in his first suit. He paused at a snapshot of him and Elena as teenagers, beaming in a park. He hadn't remembered his mom taking that photo. The sense of longing rushed back. Marjorie peeked out from the kitchen. "There you are. Come sit." Dinner's almost ready. Seated at the small dining table, he helped her set the plates, noticing how carefully she placed the silverware. She was always meticulous, a trait he inherited. When they finally started eating, the warmth of the meal and the gentle light of the lamp overhead offered a calm he desperately needed. Between bites of pot roast, she gave him a knowing look. "Whatever you're going through, I hope you know I'm here to listen." Scott hesitated. Part of him wanted to spill everything about Elena, the baby, his fear of messing up, and the pressure from the board, but the words stayed tangled in his throat. Instead, he just said, "Thanks, Ma. It means a lot." Yet the unspoken conflict lingered in the air, growing heavier by the minute. He realized that soon he would have to confront the choice head-on, either remain the distant CEO whose life revolved solely around money and reputation, or answer the call that tugged at his heart. The pressure to decide weighed on him, and he felt as though each passing day left him with fewer options and more regret. Scott sat in his office early the following morning, staring at his phone like it might spring to life on its own. The decision he'd been wrestling with loomed larger than ever: reach out to the foundation and find Elena, or continue down the safe, familiar path. Sleep-deprived and anxious, he reminded himself that doing nothing was still a choice, just one that would haunt him. He took a deep breath and dialed the number he'd seen on the New Beginnings Foundation's website. The phone rang twice before a warm, professional voice answered. "New Beginnings, Diane Brooks speaking. How can I help you?" "Hello, Diane. My name is Scott Morris. I'm a corporate sponsor, or at least I've donated before. He faltered, suddenly unsure how much he should reveal. "I wanted to inquire about the recent cases you mentioned in your emails." There was a brief silence. "Yes, Mr. Morris, I appreciate your support. We do have a number of urgent situations right now. Are you referring to someone specific?" His chest tightened. "Possibly. There's a woman who might have used your shelter, or maybe she's in need of legal assistance. Her name is Elena Martinez. She has a baby. April, I believe." A hint of recognition flickered in Diane's voice. "We had a request for help from a woman with that name a few months ago, but I'm not certain of her current whereabouts. She never completed our intake process. Many of the women we see are wary of authorities. They come and go quickly. But I do remember the case had complications." Scott's grip on the phone tightened. "Complications?" Diane sighed softly. "Elena mentioned fleeing from an abusive husband. He's apparently well connected in Mexico, which puts her in a precarious position. We tried to provide her legal counseling, but she vanished before we could arrange anything. Sometimes they're too frightened to stay." He felt an urgency rise within him. "Is there any way to find her?" I think she needs help. Well, I could check our records to see if she reached out again, or if any of our staff have seen her. Honestly, Mr. Morris, these women move around constantly for their safety. If you're looking to assist, we could keep an eye out." "I want to help," he blurted, surprising even himself with the intensity in his voice. "If you find her, please let me know. Also, if money can aid any search efforts, private investigators, more staff, whatever, just tell me." Diane hesitated, possibly taken aback by his determination. "We appreciate your generosity. I'll send you a summary of how we typically proceed, and if Elena contacts us again, I'll reach out immediately." They exchanged information and ended the call. Scott leaned back in his chair, exhaling a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He felt a rush of both relief and apprehension. He had taken that first step, a foot into unknown territory, and there was no turning back. Later that afternoon, a meeting on the 39th floor called him away from his desk. As he hurried through the corridors, he nearly collided with Penelope, who was heading to the elevator with a garment bag over her arm. She was on her way to a fitting for an upcoming gala. Her posture was immaculate, her expression guarded. "Scott," she said, pausing to steady herself, "you okay? You look like you just ran a marathon." He forced a thin smile. "I'm fine, just juggling a lot." She gave him a once-over, her gaze drifting to the tension lines on his forehead. "Look, I know we haven't had much time to finalize details for our engagement event. My mother is pestering me daily." Scott nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I understand. Let's schedule something soon." She pursed her lips but didn't push the matter. Instead, she asked, "I noticed a few calls on your office line from some non-profit group. Are you planning a new charity initiative?" Her tone sounded almost suspicious, as if she worried this might become a scandal or, worse, a distraction from the life she envisioned. He realized she'd probably seen Diane's number on his phone. "I'm just exploring a possibility," he said vaguely. "It's nothing to worry about." Penelope arched an eyebrow. "If it's for PR, it could be beneficial, but be careful. Don't let it spiral into something that takes away from the company's priorities. Shareholders pay attention to everything." He nodded, wishing he could explain how personal it was, but also knowing that the conversation would become complicated. She seemed content with his polite dismissal, stepping into the elevator as the doors slid closed. Scott caught a glimpse of her reflection in the mirrored interior, pristine, composed, and so far removed from the raw struggle that consumed his thoughts. By the time he reached the 39th floor conference room, the meeting was already in progress. He slipped into a seat and apologized for being late. While a senior analyst discussed market projections, Scott's mind drifted again. Yet this time, the swirl of guilt was accompanied by a flicker of hope. He had finally reached out, bridging the gap between his world and Elena's. If Diane could locate her, maybe he could offer real help, a safe place, legal aid, a way out of the nightmare he suspected she was living. The meeting ended, and he found himself stepping out onto a balcony to get some fresh air. The Manhattan skyline spread out before him. So many people, so many stories. Somewhere out there, Elena was doing her best to protect her baby in a city that could be both a refuge and a threat. The winter breeze stung his face, but it felt strangely invigorating. Despite the uncertainty and the risk, Scott felt a ripple of conviction. He was no longer just a bystander. And though the road ahead was unclear, he couldn't deny the sense that he was finally walking the path he was always meant to take. Scott had just ended a tense conference call with his shareholders when his phone buzzed again. He looked down to see an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. Something told him to answer. Maybe Diane had news about Elena. "Hello," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Mr. Morris, it's Diane Brooks from New Beginnings." The voice on the other end replied, "I've been reviewing our intake forms, and I'd like to discuss some potential next steps." "And could we meet in person?" A wave of relief washed over him. "Absolutely. Name a time and place." They agreed to meet at a small cafe in Midtown, not too far from his office. After wrapping up a few urgent matters, Scott slipped into a wool coat and strode out of the building. The winter wind slapped at his cheeks, reminding him how harsh the city could be for anyone without shelter. At the cafe, he spotted Diane immediately. She was a woman around 45, with short salt and pepper hair and sharp eyes that conveyed both warmth and resolve. She stood to greet him, offering a firm handshake. "I appreciate you coming," she said, motioning for him to sit. I've looked into Elena's file. We don't have a current address, but I can confirm she reached out a few months ago, then vanished. We suspect she's been living off and on in places that aren't safe, likely to evade her ex-husband. Scott settled into the chair, his heart thudding with concern. What else do you know about her situation? Diane took a moment to organize her thoughts. Ivan Guerrero is a minor politician in Mexico. We've heard rumors he has connections to organized crime. Women in this scenario often fear deportation as well as violence. It's why Elena might have refused to stay in our shelter long enough for legal processing. Leaning forward, Scott spoke quietly. Tell me how I can help. Diane regarded him thoughtfully. It's not just about money, though that does help. These women need legal advocacy and a secure place to stay. I'd advise hiring a specialized attorney who understands asylum and domestic violence cases. And if Elena is discovered by her ex-husband or his associates, security might be necessary. Scott felt a knot forming in his stomach. I have the resources to cover all of that, but how do we actually find her? She sipped her coffee, seeming to weigh her words. Our outreach team can circulate her photo among the shelters and local clinics. Sometimes, we'll hear from community leaders in the Bronx or Queens if someone fitting her description turns up. But it's delicate. She has to trust us or she'll run again. He nodded, a surge of determination coursing through him. Whatever it takes, let's get the ball rolling. Diane offered a smile, small but sincere. You realize this might be complicated, especially for someone in your public position. Scott exhaled slowly. I'm prepared. Over the next hour, Diane laid out a plan. First, they'd discreetly distribute Elena's details to trusted contacts. Second, they'd line up a top immigration attorney. Third, they'd develop a safe house strategy if Elena agreed to come under their protection. Scott took mental notes, aware each step drew him deeper into a world he'd long avoided, a world of harsh realities, far from the shining corridors of corporate Manhattan. As they were wrapping up, Diane said, You know, I've been in this field a while. People with resources often donate and disappear. But you seem genuinely committed. Scott felt the weight of her observation. I knew Elena a lifetime ago. I can't just walk away now. She nodded in understanding. It's good to see someone remember that people aren't disposable. They parted with a sense of mutual respect, and Scott walked back to his office, feeling both apprehensive and strangely empowered. The next step would be bringing this plan to life. He was used to business strategies, but this was different, a moral choice that demanded heart as much as intellect. Later that day, he had a follow-up meeting with his mother, Marjorie. Though he hadn't told her everything, he felt she deserved to know more than anyone else. They met in her apartment's modest living room, the same place where family photos served as silent witnesses to his past. Ma, he began after a brief hug, I'm trying to help someone from the old neighborhood. You might remember Elena Martinez. Marjorie's brow furrowed. Yes, I recall. She was a sweet girl. Is she all right? Scott hesitated. She's in trouble. I'm working with the foundation to find her. Marjorie gently touched his arm. I always wondered what happened to her after she left the Bronx. If there's anything I can do, let me know. He was grateful for her support, but also realized just how complicated things could get if the press discovered his involvement. Still, he couldn't turn back now. Diane Brooks was quickly becoming a mentor figure of sorts, a person who understood the complexities of immigrant life, domestic abuse, and legal labyrinths. Through her guidance, Scott felt he was gaining not just the knowledge, but also the courage to navigate this unknown territory. Leaving Marjorie's place, he gazed at the fading sunlight over Manhattan's skyline. For years, He had believed success was about detachment and focusing on the bottom line. But this new path, guided by Diane and fueled by memories of Elena, was forcing him to confront truths he'd long buried. And though every step felt risky, he also sensed he was inching closer to something profoundly important, a chance at redemption and the opportunity to be the protector he'd once promised himself he would become. On a brisk evening, just a day after Scott's meeting with Diane, Penelope insisted they attend a high-profile cocktail party hosted by one of his major investors. The event took place in a lavish penthouse overlooking Central Park, complete with crystal chandeliers and an ornate balcony. Dozens of important guests mingled under the soft lighting, clinking champagne glasses and exchanging small talk that reeked of wealth and status. Scott arrived in a tailored suit, Penelope on his arm in a shimmering navy gown. Normally, he would have played his role flawlessly, shaking hands, smiling at cameras, and discussing business expansions. But tonight, his mind drifted elsewhere. The swirl of fancy clothes, expensive liquor, and polite laughter felt hollow. "Scott, darling, come meet Mrs. Blackwood," Penelope said, guiding him toward an elegant older woman in pearls. "She's curious about the new encryption software." He summoned a polite grin. "Yes, Mrs. Blackwood. We're on schedule for a spring rollout. The platform's design ensures better protection against hacking threats." She nodded approvingly. "Splendid. My son invests heavily in your company. Stability is key, Mr. Morris, especially these days. I trust you're not too distracted by any outside ventures." Her pointed tone made Scott's jaw tighten. He recalled Walter Gibson's warnings, the subtle hints that any whiff of instability could jeopardize investor confidence. He forced a calm response. "Our entire team is fully committed to seeing the project through." The conversation ended, and Scott excused himself, weaving through the crowd until he reached a quieter corner near the balcony. Penelope trailed behind, looking annoyed. "What's gotten into you? You're barely engaging with anyone." He sipped his champagne, then placed the glass on a silver tray carried by a passing waiter. "I'm just thinking about work." Penelope lowered her voice, her words coming out like a reprimand. "Scott, these events matter. You know that. They give investors a sense of trust in you, in us." He caught the faint hitch in her tone. Despite their carefully managed relationship, Penelope had always prided herself on being the perfect partner, someone who could host luxurious galas and charm wealthy patrons. She thrived in these settings. "I know," he replied with a sigh. "I just can't stop thinking about other things." Penelope raised an eyebrow. "Look, if this is about that charity, I'd prefer we keep it low-key. Philanthropy is fine, but not if it risks overshadowing our engagement or worrying the board." Scott stared out at the city lights. "Are you hearing yourself? What about the actual people who need help? It's more than a PR move." She hesitated, glancing around to ensure no one was eavesdropping. "I care about people, Scott, but we have responsibilities. We're close to finalizing wedding plans and major investments. This is not the time to pick up complicated personal causes." His frustration simmered. "So, I should just ignore everything that's going on in my head?" "What I'm saying," she replied tersely, "is choose your battles wisely. We built our public image on being a power couple, stable, reliable, always in control. Before Scott could respond, one of the event's hosts approached, pulling them into another round of introductions. For the rest of the night, he played along, though every smile felt forced. He thought about how drastically his priorities had shifted in just a few days. Life in these polished rooms no longer satisfied him the way it once did. Later, as they rode home in a sleek black town car, Penelope browsed her phone while Scott stared at the passing buildings. She broke the silence. "Tomorrow, my mother wants to finalize the floral arrangements for the engagement party. Please don't forget. He looked at her profile, a twinge of guilt surfacing. I won't. She softened, placing her hand gently on his arm. Just promise me you won't let yourself get caught up in something that damages what we've built. Her words echoed in his mind long after they parted ways for the night. While Penelope returned to her own luxury condo, he stayed up in his penthouse, pacing. He checked his phone repeatedly, half expecting an update from Diane. None came. He realized that while his everyday obligations had once felt so urgent, shareholder dinners, product rollouts, maintaining public appearances, they now felt like paper shields against a storm of moral responsibility. The next morning, he arrived early at the office, ignoring curious stares from staff who sensed his change in demeanor. He opened his calendar and cancelled a handful of non-essential meetings, clearing space for a personal appointment. In that moment, he understood he was making a deliberate choice. He was stepping away from the carefully cultivated routine of polite compliance and venturing into uncertain territory. Though the implications were serious, potential conflict with investors, a strained engagement, negative press, he felt a surprising lightness. Because for the first time in a long while, he was following a deeper calling. He recalled Diane's steady reassurance and Marjorie's unconditional support. Most of all, he remembered Elena's eyes in the snow, pleading for a chance at survival. And he knew that no matter what pressure or warnings he faced, he couldn't turn his back now. With a determined breath, he closed his laptop and headed out the door. It was time to break away from the confines of corporate obligations. The ordinary world he knew so well was fading behind him, replaced by a mission that demanded he step into the unknown, and maybe, in doing so, find the man he'd always wanted to be. On a crisp winter morning, Scott stood outside an aging brick building in Queens, a place far removed from the glossy skyscrapers of Midtown. The battered sign out front read, "New Beginnings Outreach Center" in peeling letters. It was the Foundation's main office for field services, and Diane Brooks had arranged to meet him there so he could witness their operations firsthand. He climbed a narrow flight of stairs and entered a dimly lit waiting area. The furniture was mismatched, a worn love seat, a couple of plastic chairs, and a small reception desk stacked with brochures in multiple languages. A sense of urgency and hope filled the space. Scott felt out of place in his tailored coat and polished shoes. Diane approached with a warm smile. "I'm glad you could make it, Mr. Morris. I thought it would help you see how complicated it can be for women in Elena's situation." "Please, call me Scott," he said, returning her smile. "And thank you for having me." She guided him into a cramped office where two social workers hunched over a desk piled with folders. Diane introduced them as Rachel and Carlos, specialists who handled intake and crisis management. They were polite, but clearly overwhelmed. "We work with limited funding," Diane explained, gesturing to the worn computers and outdated file cabinets. "There's never enough space or staff, but we do what we can." As he looked around, Scott's mind flashed to his own corporate headquarters, gleaming surfaces, top-of-the-line equipment, a pantry stocked with gourmet snacks. The contrast stung, fueling his resolve to help. They moved to a small break room, where Diane offered him a cup of coffee from a drip machine. Over the rim of his paper cup, he saw volunteers hustling by, some carrying donated clothing, others tending to worried mothers. It was a busy hive of compassion, vastly different from the sterile efficiency he was used to. "I wanted you to come here," Diane said, "so you could understand the context. If we do track Elena down, she's going to need more than just a lawyer. She'll need a sense of community, a place where she feels safe." Scott nodded. "I can see that. How do we begin?" Diane led him back to the main hall, where a bulletin board featured photos and handwritten notes seeking missing relatives or help with rent. She pointed to a picture of a woman that might have been Elena, dark hair, worn face, and a child in her arms. One of our staff posted this a while back. After Elena's first visit, we got a couple of calls, but nothing concrete. He stared at the photo, a pang in his chest. Though the image was low resolution, he recognized the outline of her face. Any leads at all? Diane shook her head. Some said they saw her in the Bronx, others in Brooklyn. These women often move nightly, staying one step ahead of danger. But we keep looking. Just then, a door to an adjoining room opened, and a tall, lanky young man stepped out. He wore a volunteer badge and had a stack of flyers in his hands. Diane introduced him as Matteo, who had once been homeless himself and now helped with outreach. Matteo knows a lot of the community networks, Diane said. He might be able to share more about how we locate missing clients. Matteo nodded. We visit churches, check soup kitchens, talk to people on the street. Sometimes, if someone recognizes a face, they call us, but it's tricky. Many are scared of official help. Scott rubbed his chin, absorbing the complexity. It sounds like we need a coordinated effort. I'm prepared to fund additional resources, maybe more staff or even digital tools to track leads. Diane exchanged a glance with Matteo. That would be amazing. But be mindful, trust is earned face to face. Some new fancy system might not mean much if the community doesn't believe in us. Scott thought of how, in business, a well-implemented platform could streamline everything. Here, the human element was paramount. Understood, we'll do it the right way. He spent the next hour touring the facility, meeting volunteers and listening to stories of survival that humbled him. One woman described escaping an abusive partner who threatened her family back home. Another said she'd traveled across 3 states to get away from a violent household, only to end up in a cramped shelter. Through it all, he noted their resilience, a quiet strength forged in hardship. When he finally emerged onto the street, the winter sky had turned overcast, threatening snow. Diane walked him back to his car. "You're stepping into a whole new world," she said gently. "It can be chaotic and heartbreaking, but it can also be incredibly meaningful." He gazed down the street where everyday people bustled around, each with their own concerns. "I used to think I understood hardship because I grew up in the Bronx. But this is different," he admitted softly. She nodded. "Money helps, but empathy is what truly saves lives." Scott gripped the door handle of his car, pausing before climbing inside. He'd just crossed a threshold into an unknown realm, one that demanded he set aside the cold calculations of corporate life for the nuanced human complexities of survival. As the engine roared to life, he felt a mixture of apprehension and resolve. He was a stranger here, but no longer an idle spectator. The world special, as Diane had called it in passing, was now his world too. Early the next morning, Scott awoke to the sound of his phone vibrating on the nightstand. Rubbing his eyes, he squinted at the screen, a text from Diane Brooks. "We might have a lead. Call me when you can." Without hesitation, he sat up and dialed her number. Diane answered in a hushed tone, explaining that a street vendor in the Bronx had mentioned seeing a woman who fit Elena's description frequenting a particular bodega. She was asking for baby formula and occasionally slept in the back alley with her child when she couldn't afford a motel. Scott's heart twisted. "That's unbelievably harsh. Do you think it's really her?" "We can't be sure," Diane said, "but it's worth checking out. Matteo is heading there today. If you want to come along, meet him at our outreach van." Within the hour, Scott was on his way to the Bronx. He hadn't been back to his old neighborhood in years. He'd always felt torn between nostalgia and guilt. Nostalgia for the days he spent with Elena before her deportation. guilt for never returning after he found success. As the streets became more familiar, he felt a knot in his stomach. He met Matteo near a rundown corner store, its sign half-lit even in daylight. The outreach van, white with a modest New Beginnings logo, parked discreetly across the street. Matteo was handing out small care packages, items like socks, hygiene products, and snacks to people who approached. "You really think we'll find Elena here?" Scott asked, scanning the street. Matteo shrugged. "Worth a shot. We'll do what we always do, talk to folks, see who's seen her, keep it informal so she doesn't feel threatened." They split up. Matteo went inside the bodega to chat with the owner. Scott walked the block, showing Elena's photo on his phone to passers-by. Some shook their heads, never having seen her. Others claimed they might have but weren't sure. He received a few wary stares, possibly because he was too well dressed for the area. After about half an hour, no concrete information had emerged. Matteo appeared from the bodega, a faint line of worry on his forehead. "No luck yet, but the shopkeeper mentioned a woman with a baby stopping by every now and then to get formula with whatever coins she's collected. Could be Elena, could be someone else." Scott's gaze drifted to a graffiti-covered wall near an alleyway. This was the kind of place he and Elena used to pass through in their teens, laughing about how they'd escape to a better future. Now, it felt haunting. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the alley, an older man pushing a shopping cart. He caught sight of the photo on Scott's phone and paused. "Hey," the man rasped, pointing a bony finger. "I've seen someone like that. Not sure if it's the same lady, but she's got a little baby. She sleeps behind the old laundromat some nights." Scott's pulse quickened. "Where is that?" The man jerked his thumb across the street. "1 block down, on the corner." Scott thanked him, and he and Matteo hurried in that direction. The laundromat was a shabby place with flickering fluorescent lights visible through the window. Around back, they found a narrow space littered with trash bags and a faint odor of stale detergent, but it was empty, save for a cardboard pallet that looked recently used. Clearly, someone had been sleeping there. A sense of frustration and sadness washed over Scott. They were so close, yet Elena remained just out of reach. If this was her spot, she might return, or she might have already moved on. Matteo suggested they leave a note in Spanish and English, attaching it to the wall with tape, offering information on how to find help at New Beginnings. Scott wrote a personal message. "Elena, if this is you, please reach out. We can help. Scott." They lingered a while, hoping she might appear. Scott tried to imagine Elena's state of mind, frightened, exhausted, determined to protect her baby. Had she changed much beyond the exhaustion he saw on Fifth Avenue? Did she remember their old bond? So many questions, none of them with easy answers. When the sun began to set, they finally headed back to the outreach van. "We'll keep checking other spots," Matteo said, though his tone carried the resignation of someone used to uncertain outcomes. "I'll come back tonight, maybe with a volunteer, see if she returns." Scott clapped Matteo's shoulder in gratitude. He couldn't shake the gnawing sense of disappointment, yet despite the fruitless search, he felt more grounded in this environment than he had in any boardroom meeting all week. He was adapting, learning how to talk to strangers, to ask for help humbly, to scrawl personal pleas on a scrap of paper in a dingy alleyway. As he drove away, he passed familiar sights. The dilapidated basketball court where he'd shot hoops as a teen, the stoop where kids used to hang out, the corner bodega that once sold him and Elena cold sodas on sweltering summer afternoons. Everything was both the same and irrevocably changed. Though he hadn't found Elena today, the experience only cemented his resolve. He was beginning to realize that a journey of this sort didn't follow quick wins or linear progress. It required persistence, patience, and a willingness to immerse himself in a world he'd left behind. And that, he sensed, might be the true test of his commitment. 2 days later, Diane invited Scott to a small gathering at the Foundation's main office. She explained it was a monthly meeting where women who had successfully transitioned out of dire circumstances would share tips with those still in crisis. Diane thought it could offer Scott deeper insight into the kinds of struggles Elena might be facing and perhaps introduce him to someone who had known her. When he arrived, the modest conference room was already filled with quiet chatter. Folding chairs formed a circle, and on a long table to one side sat trays of cookies, fruit punch, and donated pastries. The atmosphere was one of cautious optimism, far from the hushed desperation Scott had encountered before. Diane welcomed him warmly, then introduced him to various attendees. Among them was Luisa Ramirez, a slender woman in her late 20s with a determined set to her jaw. She had fled an abusive partner in Mexico, much like Elena. Now, Luisa volunteered at the Foundation, sharing her story to inspire others. "Luisa, this is Scott Morris," Diane said gently. "He's helping us locate someone who might be in a similar situation to yours." Luisa shook Scott's hand with a respectful nod. "If there's anything I can do, I will. I owe Diane and the Foundation my life." They took seats in the circle. One by one, participants spoke. Some told of harassment at the border, others of fear that their ex-partners would track them down. A few described triumphant moments, finding steady work, getting kids enrolled in safe daycare. Through it all, Scott listened intently, absorbing a range of experiences vastly different from his usual environment. When it was Luisa's turn, she stood and recounted her flight from Mexico. She spoke of how her ex-husband had local police on his side, leaving her nowhere to turn. One day, she decided to run, crossing the border with just a small backpack. Eventually, she found refuge in New York. Although the journey was brutal, she'd persevered with help from the Foundation. After the meeting, Scott approached Luisa in a quieter corner. "Your story was powerful," he said sincerely. "I can see parallels to Elena's situation." Luisa's eyes flickered with recognition. "Elena Martinez. I've heard that name from some of the women who come and go. They say her ex-husband is well-connected, dangerous." Scott felt a surge of hope. "Any idea where she might be staying?" Luisa shook her head regretfully. "No one seems sure, but I heard that at one point, she worked a few hours cleaning a motel in Brooklyn for some cash. She stopped showing up, though. Maybe she moved on, but don't lose hope. She's got a strong spirit. Everyone says she never gives up." He nodded, grateful for the encouragement. "Thank you. If you hear anything else, let me know." Later, he found Diane by the refreshments, chatting with a volunteer. She turned to Scott with a thoughtful expression. "This is what I meant by building trust and allies. Luisa's willing to help spread the word discreetly. That's often more effective than any formal channel." Scott gazed around the room, where women offered each other hugs and words of comfort. "It's humbling to see. They're survivors, not just victims." Diane handed him a styrofoam cup of fruit punch. "Exactly. And allies come in different forms. Sometimes it's someone who's been through a similar struggle. Other times, it's a concerned bystander. In your case, with your resources, you can make a significant impact if you stay committed." He sipped the punch, though he barely tasted it. His mind was already spinning with possibilities. Funding additional outreach staff, arranging a rotating shelter system, or even setting up a private fund for legal defenses. Every conversation here felt like a piece of a puzzle he was piecing together, trying to create a picture of Elena's survival network. Before leaving, Luisa approached him again. "If you ever want to talk more, or if you find Elena and she needs someone who understands, I'm here." She scribbled her phone number on the back of a Foundation pamphlet. He thanked her, tucking the paper safely into his coat pocket. It struck him how these connections, these small acts of kindness, could mean the difference between life and death for women like Elena. Though he was used to deals worth millions, this felt more meaningful, a transaction of trust, empathy, and genuine solidarity. Outside, the night air was crisp. Scott lingered on the sidewalk, taking a moment to reflect on the transformation he was undergoing. He'd always believed success was measured by balance sheets and public image. Now, he realized true success might be measured by how many lives you touched or saved. The sense of purpose thrilled him, but it also weighed heavily on his conscience. He knew that the deeper he went, the more vulnerable he became to backlash from his corporate circle. Still, as he climbed into his car and stared at the pamphlet with Louisa's phone number, he felt a renewed conviction. Allies like Louisa, Diane, and Matteo were rallying around this cause, around Elena. He wasn't alone. If he could harness their courage and combine it with his own resources, perhaps together they could rewrite Elena's story, and maybe even his own. Scott was in the middle of a strategic planning session with his executive team when his assistant entered with an apologetic look. "I'm sorry, Mr. Morris, but there's an urgent call from Walter Gibson." The tension in the room spiked. Walter was a significant investor, and his calls rarely spelled anything good if they arrived unexpectedly. Scott excused himself and headed to his private office. He picked up the phone. "Walter, what can I do for you?" he asked, keeping his tone even. Walter's voice crackled through the line, barely hiding his annoyance. "I've been hearing rumors, Scott. Something about you diverting company funds to a non-profit, or planning to—" "What the hell is going on?" Scott clenched his jaw. Clearly, word had spread that he was taking a personal interest in the New Beginnings Foundation. "It's not a diversion. I've allocated some of my personal resources, and yes, I'm exploring philanthropic activities." Walter let out a dry laugh. "Philanthropy, great, but you know how this looks to our stakeholders, especially when we're on the cusp of a major product launch. They want stability, not headlines about the CEO's extracurricular missions." Scott tapped a pen against his desk, irritation boiling beneath his skin. "I'm allowed to support causes I believe in, Walter. This doesn't affect the company's bottom line." Walter's voice hardened. "It does when you're spending less time in the office and more time gallivanting around with these charities. Perception matters, Scott. I've already had 2 major investors call me, questioning your focus." A cold pit formed in Scott's stomach. He recalled the countless times he'd assured his board that everything was under control. "Let me handle it. Our next quarterly report will speak for itself." Walter sighed, the sound harsh through the receiver. "Fine. But understand this, if I get the sense you're jeopardizing the company's future, I won't hesitate to bring it to the board." The line went dead before Scott could respond. He sat there for a moment, staring at the silent phone. A swirl of anger, fear, and defiance flooded him. This was exactly the sort of confrontation he'd dreaded, one that pitted his moral convictions against the corporate machine he'd built. Taking a steadying breath, he returned to the conference room and tried to carry on as if everything was normal. Yet the day's pressures were far from over. As he was leaving the building that evening, he noticed a sleek black SUV idling near the entrance. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit stepped onto the sidewalk, intercepting Scott. His accent was subtle but noticeable. "Mr. Morris, my name is Arturo. I work with Ivan Guerrero," he said, slipping his hands into his coat pockets. "We understand you have a personal connection with Elena Martinez." Scott's pulse surged. "Excuse me? How did you—" Arturo smirked, tilting his head slightly. "Ivan has many contacts. Word travels. He'd like you to know that Elena is his wife, and their child is under his guardianship. You're meddling in affairs you don't understand." Scott's jaw tightened. Elena fled a dangerous situation. She's not looking to be found by Ivan. Arturo's eyes narrowed. You'd be surprised how determined Ivan can be. He prefers to resolve matters without legal complications or public drama. If you continue your involvement, well, let's just say complications will arise. A cold rage ignited in Scott's chest. Threatening me won't stop me from helping her. Arturo shrugged as if unconcerned. You may have resources, Mr. Morris, but Ivan has influence, both sides of the border. I suggest you reconsider your priorities. With that, Arturo returned to the SUV, and it pulled away. Scott stood on the sidewalk, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He'd expected pushback from shareholders, but direct intimidation from Ivan's associates took the conflict to a new, dangerous level. Later that night, as he tried to calm himself in his penthouse, the day's events replayed in his mind: Walter's ultimatum and Arturo's veiled threats. He poured himself a scotch, sat on the edge of his sofa, and stared at the city skyline. Somewhere out there, Elena was living in fear, and now he'd become a target of intimidation simply for trying to help. 1,000 questions filled his thoughts. Could Ivan really reach him through legal or violent means? Would the board remove him if they perceived his involvement as a liability? And what about Penelope? If this became a scandal, would she stand by him or distance herself for the sake of her social status? Yet amid the swirl of doubt, a single realization stood firm. He couldn't abandon Elena. Not again. He'd promised himself he'd never be powerless like the night she was deported. If that meant risking his corporate position or even his personal safety, he would do it. He picked up his phone, intending to call Diane to warn her about the threat, but paused. A quick glance at the clock told him it was late. Instead, he drafted an email detailing the encounter with Arturo and urging extra caution in searching for Elena. Then he set the phone aside, letting the city lights blink silently in the distance. He was in the thick of his first real clash with forces determined to keep Elena under their control or out of reach. The road ahead was fraught with tension, but he felt a spark of steel in his spine. This time he would not retreat. This time he had the power and the will to fight back no matter the cost. In the days following his encounter with Ivan's associate, Arturo, Scott found it harder to focus on the routine operations of his company. He tried to maintain a front of normalcy, attending board meetings, reviewing quarterly projections, but his attention drifted toward every new message or phone call, hoping it would bring news of Elena. Meanwhile, Diane from New Beginnings kept him in the loop, but the updates offered little progress. Elena remained elusive. Late one evening, Scott invited Marjorie over for dinner at his penthouse. Although the space exuded understated luxury, soft grey furniture, abstract art on the walls, Marjorie's presence grounded it with a sense of home. Over plates of takeout Thai food, they discussed everything except the tension swirling around him, until Marjorie finally spoke up. "You look exhausted, son," she said gently, "more than usual. Is it the business?" He poked at his noodles, hesitating. "It's more than that. I've got a major investor on my back, and there's someone else trying to scare me off this cause." "Cause? You mean Elena?" Marjorie asked, her brow creasing with concern. "What do you mean someone's trying to scare you?" Scott paused, uncertain how much to reveal. He didn't want to alarm her, but she was his mother. She deserved honesty. "Some man approached me outside the office, said he worked for Ivan. Basically warned me to back down or face consequences." Marjorie's hand froze mid-air, chopsticks clutched tight. "Oh, Scott, that's dangerous. Have you considered going to the police?" He shook his head. "Ivan's well connected. I doubt a simple police report would help, and I don't want to spook Elena if she hears the cops are involved. She already doesn't trust authorities." His mother looked troubled, but placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "You must be careful. But I know you, Scott. You won't rest until you see this through. After dinner, she left with a hug that felt tighter than usual, as if trying to shield him from the looming threat. Alone in his living room, he gazed out at Manhattan's glittering skyline. He wondered if Elena was somewhere below that sparkle, hunched against the cold, threatened by unseen dangers. The following week, Scott dedicated more resources to searching for Elena, channeling funds to Diane's foundation for additional outreach. To maintain secrecy, he avoided putting anything official on the company's books. He personally wrote checks, labeling them under private donations. He also engaged a specialized immigration lawyer recommended by Diane, Rachel Castillo, a sharp-minded attorney with a track record of defending clients in precarious domestic violence and asylum cases. He met Rachel in a quiet corner of a midtown coffee shop, slim, with a confident demeanor. She got straight to the point. If we find Elena, we need to secure legal protection immediately. Restraining orders, potential asylum claims, maybe a VAWA petition if she's been abused. But we need her cooperation. Scott sipped his coffee, the strong aroma doing little to calm his nerves. She might be reluctant to trust lawyers. She's been through a deportation before. Rachel nodded. That's common, especially if Ivan's powerful back home. But if there's proof of his violence or corruption, we can fight to keep her and the baby safe. A twinge of hope flickered in Scott's chest. I'll do whatever's necessary. Money, security, anything. Their conversation was cut short when Scott's phone vibrated. A text from Diane. Urgent. Meet me at the shelter ASAP. Possible sighting of Elena. His pulse quickened. He excused himself, thanked Rachel, and rushed to hail a cab. The New Beginnings shelter in Queens was a modest building with chipped paint and a flickering outdoor lamp. Diane stood by the entrance, arms crossed, speaking with a flustered volunteer. We got a tip from someone who saw a woman matching Elena's description in a nearby park, Diane said the moment Scott approached. Apparently, she was carrying a baby and looked distressed. Do we know where she is now? He asked, breathless. The volunteer shook her head. She left the park a few minutes before we arrived. We searched the area but came up empty. Frustration pulsed through Scott. They had been close. Yet again. The volunteer handed him a crumpled note. She spoke briefly to a woman in the park, said her name was Elena and that she was trying to find some place called St. Anthony's. She asked for directions. Diane's eyes widened. St. Anthony's Church is a few miles north. It's known for letting people shelter in the basement during extreme weather. Scott looked to Diane, determination kicking in. Let's go there. Moments later, he was navigating the Queen's streets in his car, Diane in the passenger seat making calls to see if St. Anthony's had indeed taken in a young mother and child. It felt like another test, another chance to close the gap between them and Elena. The swirling questions. Would Ivan's men appear again? Could Elena trust them? Hovered in his mind, but he shoved them aside, one test at a time. They arrived at the church as the sun began to set, the stone facade cast in a dim orange glow. Scott parked hastily and rushed to the entrance. Inside, a nun greeted them quietly, leading them down a narrow hall to the basement. It was empty except for some old folding chairs and a few cots, no sign of Elena. The nun shook her head apologetically. A young woman with a baby was here earlier but left in a hurry. She seemed frightened. Scott closed his eyes, swallowing a wave of disappointment. Still, the fact that Elena was searching for refuge hinted she hadn't given up. As he stood there in the faintly lit basement, he realized that each missed encounter, each small test, hardened his resolve. One day, the test would end with her safe in their care. That faith, however slim, kept him going, even as the shadows of Ivan's threats and corporate pressures loomed larger than ever. For the next several days, every hour felt like a collision of moral and professional demands. Scott's schedule became a juggling act, secret meetings with Rachel Castillo to strategize legal options for Elena, urgent calls from Diane about new leads, and high-stakes negotiations with corporate partners who expected his undivided attention. It was wearing on him, and people at the office began to notice. He was in the middle of finalizing a key contract with a European telecom giant when Penelope showed up unannounced at his office. Clad in a sophisticated black suit, she carried a slim folder of wedding planning details under her arm. The tension in her posture was unmistakable. "Scott, we need to talk," she said in a low voice, glancing at his assistant, who hastily vacated the room. He motioned for Penelope to sit, though he remained standing, his back against the edge of his desk. "Is this about the engagement party?" he asked, noticing the folder. "Yes, partly." She flipped the folder open, revealing glossy images of floral arrangements and menus, "but also about your personal project. My mother heard rumors you've been pouring money into some immigrant shelter. People are talking, Scott, investors, board members. And with our wedding on the horizon," he rubbed his temples, feeling a headache forming. "Penelope, this is important to me. A woman from my past is in real danger." She met his gaze, her eyes cold with frustration. "I appreciate philanthropy, but there's a difference between making a charitable donation and becoming personally entangled in a situation that could hurt the company and us." He felt a surge of anger. "This isn't about PR or hurting the company. It's a matter of life and death for someone I care about." Penelope tightened her grip on the folder. "Look, I'm trying to be understanding, but our wedding is weeks away. The last thing we need is negative press. My family's concerned you'll drag us into a legal or political scandal." A bitter taste filled his mouth. He remembered the early days of their relationship, when everything was framed in terms of business synergy and social advantage. Now her priorities felt glaringly at odds with his renewed sense of moral duty. "Penelope, I'm not going to stop. If that means the press picks up the story, so be it." She stared at him in silence for a moment, then closed the folder with a snap. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you if this blows up in our faces." With that, she turned on her heel and left. Scott slumped into his chair, pressing his palms against his eyes. He felt the cracks in his life widening, Penelope's disapproval, Walter Gibson's threats, and the looming risk of Ivan's retaliation. At times, he wondered if he was strong enough to hold it all together. That evening, as he left the office, he discovered two of his security guards waiting outside. They explained that a suspicious figure had been seen lurking in the building's lobby earlier. A chill ran down his spine at the possibility it could be Arturo or another of Ivan's men. He told the guards to stay alert, then hurried home, feeling the strain of being watched. When he arrived at his penthouse, he found an email from Rachel Castillo. She had uncovered some documents indicating Ivan was under investigation for illegal campaign contributions. "If we can tie Elena's flight to credible threats stemming from his crimes, we have a strong chance at asylum," Rachel wrote. "But we need Elena's statement." Scott stared at the email, imagining Elena's fear if she knew the lengths Ivan would go to. Yet Rachel's discovery offered a glimmer of hope. Finally, something they could use against him. He forwarded the information to Diane, emphasizing its urgency. If Elena came forward, they had a viable path. Late that night, Scott gazed out over the city from his living room window, lost in thought. Marjorie's words echoed in his mind. "You must be careful." Penelope's warning also lingered, though it felt more self-serving than protective. Then there was Elena herself, somewhere out there with her baby, relying on her own grit and whatever kindness she could find. Would she be able to trust him enough to step forward? He decided to call his mother, needing a dose of unconditional support. She answered in a groggy voice, but perked up when she realized it was him. "Scott, honey, everything okay?" He explained the day's events in a tired, halting voice. Marjorie listened quietly. "I believe in you," she said at last, "but you can't carry this alone. Let people help you, whether it's Diane, your guards, or that lawyer. You're trying to shoulder all the responsibility by yourself." "I know," he murmured, feeling a swell of gratitude for her. "I just don't want to let anyone down. Elena, the company, you..." Marjorie's voice softened. "You've never let me down, son. And as for Elena, you're doing more than most would. Keep that heart of yours open, but keep your head on straight. Hard times demand both." He ended the call feeling a bit lighter. Yes, the conflicts were deepening. Penelope's impatience, corporate pressures, the risk of Ivan's retaliation. But for the first time in years, Scott sensed a purpose beyond profit margins. Even if it cost him dearly, he was determined to see this through. In the darkness of his penthouse, he resolved that no matter what new trials arose, he would not abandon Elena or the baby she protected with every ounce of courage she had left. 2 mornings later, a sharp knock on Scott's office door unsettled him. He looked up from his laptop to see Walter Gibson standing there, flanked by 2 other board members, Paula Green and Simon Lee. Their expressions were stony, clearly brimming with discontent. "Walter, Paula, Simon, come in," Scott said, clearing his throat. He felt a spike of anxiety, recalling the last conversation with Walter. This didn't bode well. They stepped in, closing the door behind them. Walter took the lead, depositing a thin folder onto Scott's desk. "We need answers about your recent activities." Paula, a savvy CFO with graying hair, chimed in. "We've received concerns from investors about your frequent absences and alleged funneling of personal funds into uncertain causes." Simon, usually more reserved, nodded. "They fear you're distracted. They need reassurance." Scott forced a calm demeanor. "I've been tending to private matters, yes, but that hasn't hindered our performance. Our revenue is steady, and the new encryption product is on track for launch." Walter opened the folder, revealing a few printed articles, blog posts and minor news sites speculating on Scott's involvement with an immigrant shelter. This kind of publicity could explode if the mainstream media picks it up. Investors are wary of controversy, especially involving a potentially corrupt Mexican politician. Is there truth to these stories? Scott leaned back, taking a moment to choose his words. "I won't deny I've taken a personal interest in helping a woman in dire straits. And yes, I'm working with a non-profit, but it's all my private money, not corporate funds." "That may be so," Walter said, "but the optics remain. We can't risk a scandal. We're on the verge of major partnerships, and we don't want to scare them off." Paula's voice softened slightly. "We understand you have your reasons, but the board has a responsibility to safeguard the company. If the market believes our CEO is embroiled in a personal conflict with dangerous individuals, shares could plummet." An anger rose in Scott's chest. "So, you want me to drop everything? Turn my back on someone who needs help? We want you to be discreet," Walter said curtly. "If you must continue, do it quietly. Limit your exposure. Right now, it seems you're too entangled." Scott felt cornered. He thought about Elena, likely still wandering with her baby, and how he'd come so close to finding her. There was no way he could abandon the effort, not after all the progress, albeit small, he'd made. "I hear your concerns," he said finally, his voice tight, "but I have no intention of letting the company fall apart, nor do I intend to abandon my moral obligations." Walter exchanged a glance with Paula and Simon. "Fine. We'll hold off on any formal action, but consider this a warning. The board will reconvene in a month, and we'll evaluate your performance and public standing. If problems persist, we'll vote on further measures. They left, tension filling the space they vacated. Scott stood at his desk, blood pounding in his ears. This was the unseen wall he'd been dreading, the moment where moral duty slammed against corporate interest. If the board felt he was a liability, they could force him out as CEO. The very company he had built from the ground up could slip from his grasp. As the day wore on, he tried to focus on the encryption product's final touches, but each time his phone rang or vibrated, he jolted, half expecting another threat from Ivan's camp or an investor meltdown. By evening, his nerves were frayed. He decided to leave early and visit the Foundation's office in Queens, seeking solace among people who shared his convictions. At New Beginnings, he found Diane in a small office, reviewing documents by the harsh glow of a single desk lamp. She looked up, brow creased with worry. Rough day. You could say that, Scott exhaled, dropping into a plastic chair. He explained the board's ultimatum and the growing fear that he might lose everything if he continued down this path. Diane offered a sympathetic smile. I won't pretend that isn't serious. But you need to ask yourself, what's more important, your title or your conscience? Scott stared at the worn carpet. I'm trying to do the right thing, but I feel like I'm pushing against walls on all sides. If I lose my position, I lose the leverage that could protect Elena. Who's going to listen to a former CEO with no power? Diane tilted her head. Don't underestimate the influence you have as a person, not just a CEO. Your knowledge, your network, they won't vanish the moment you step down, but I understand. This is your life's work. They fell silent for a moment, the room's quiet punctuated by the distant hum of a space heater. Finally, Diane spoke again, more softly. We got word of another possible sighting of Elena near a community center in the Bronx. Mateo's checking it out tonight. Scott's eyes flicked up, a spark of hope igniting. Should I go with him? She hesitated. He said it might be safer if he goes alone first. Elena might recognize him from our last round of flyers. We don't want to spook her if you show up unexpectedly. He understood, though a pang of disappointment rippled through him. Keep me posted. I'll be ready if there's any sign of her. Diane nodded. And be cautious yourself. A man from Ivan's circle came around earlier, asking questions about you. We told him nothing, obviously. Scott's jaw tightened. Between corporate threats and Ivan's goons, his world was closing in. That was the wall he faced, a barrier formed by greed, fear, and the cruelty of those willing to exploit the vulnerable. As he left the Foundation that evening, the question weighed on him like an anchor. How far would he go? What would he sacrifice to tear that wall down and keep Elena safe? 2 nights later, Mateo called, just after midnight. Scott, who had dozed off on his couch, startled awake at the buzzing phone. Heart-pounding, he answered, "Scott, it's Mateo." The voice came in rushed, almost breathless. "I think I found her." Scott nearly dropped the phone. "Where? Is she safe?" "She's at a halfway house run by a local church, St. Luke's. A contact recognized the picture on our flyers." Elena was dropped off there an hour ago with her baby. Relief warred with excitement, making Scott's voice shake. "That's incredible. Did you talk to her?" Mateo hesitated. "Not yet. The staff said she's in bad shape, exhausted, sick, and paranoid about people finding her. But yes, it's her. She mentioned the name April for her baby." "Give me the address," Scott said, already searching for shoes. After scribbling down directions, he threw on a coat and hurried out. Adrenaline coursed through him, overriding the fact that it was a frigid winter night. When he arrived at the small, nondescript brick building, Mateo was waiting on the porch, his breath visible in the cold. "They're letting her rest," he said quietly, leading Scott inside. The living room was simple, worn couches, a few chairs, a table with a bowl of fruit. Warmth from a space heater created a gentle lull. A middle-aged volunteer named Sister Kathleen greeted them, her voice hushed. "Eleanor's upstairs with her baby, trying to sleep. She's weak and hasn't eaten much, but she's safe here." Scott's heart pounded. "Could I see her?" Sister Kathleen seemed to weigh his request. "She's very wary. Perhaps you should wait until morning. Give her a chance to rest." He nodded reluctantly, agreeing it was best not to overwhelm Elena. Still, the thought of finally being just a few feet away after so many near misses left him trembling with pent-up emotion. He collapsed onto one of the couches in the living room, refusing to leave, though it meant dozing in an unfamiliar place for the remainder of the night. At dawn, Sister Kathleen gently woke him, pointing upstairs. "Elena's awake. She asked who you were." Scott climbed the narrow staircase, his heartbeat an audible thud in his ears. In a small bedroom with plain white walls, he found Elena sitting on a creaking bed, April nestled in her arms. Even though her dark hair was disheveled and her cheeks hollow from stress, she was still the Elena he remembered. For a moment, neither spoke, their gazes locked in a swirl of memory and disbelief. "Scott," she whispered, her voice raspy. April stirred at the sound, letting out a soft whimper. He approached slowly, crouching a few feet away. "It's me. I've been looking everywhere for you." Tears glistened in her eyes, but her expression remained guarded. "Why? After so many years?" He swallowed, recalling all the times he'd wondered the same thing. "I saw you that day on Fifth Avenue, begging in the cold, and I couldn't just let that be it. I needed to help." Elena clutched the baby closer. "Everything's so complicated. Ivan has people everywhere." "I don't want anyone else getting hurt." Scott gently reached out, stopping short of touching her hand. "I know, but we have a plan to keep you safe, to get you legal help, a place to stay. All of it. You just need to let us." A moment passed, and then Elena bowed her head, her thin shoulders shaking. "I'm so tired. I just want April to be safe." Scott inched forward, sitting on the edge of the bed. The child, April, blinked up at him, her wide brown eyes mirroring Elena's. It took all of his restraint not to cry. "You both deserve safety. Let me help." She gave a small nod, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Okay." For the first time in months, Scott felt a glimmer of triumph. They had found Elena, and she was willing to trust him, at least a little. He hurried downstairs, updated Matteo and Sister Kathleen, and began making calls. First to Diane, who promised to send a counselor, then to Rachel Castillo, who would prepare the paperwork for protective orders and potential asylum. In the midst of this small victory, however, the fragility of the situation weighed on him. Elena looked physically worn, and every mention of Ivan's name sent tension rippling through her. Plus, the hostility from Walter and the board still loomed, and Ivan's men could be watching. Yet for now, in that cramped hallway of the halfway house, Scott closed his eyes and drew a trembling breath of gratitude. After all the searching, Elena was no longer just a memory or a rumor. She was here with April in her arms, and they were finally on the first step towards sanctuary. Over the next week, Elena gradually regained some strength while staying in the modest shelter at St. Luke's. Word of her location was kept tightly guarded. Only Diane, Matteo, Sister Kathleen, and Scott knew the details. Each day, Scott visited, bringing supplies for April and hot meals for Elena. He also arranged a rotating guard from a private security firm, just in case Ivan's men showed up unannounced. One afternoon, Rachel Castillo arrived to begin the legal process. She and Elena spoke quietly in the shelter's small office, the door shut for privacy. Scott waited outside, pacing the hallway. He could hear soft murmurs, but couldn't make out the words. After nearly an hour, Rachel emerged, looking both satisfied and concerned. She's agreed to file for a protective order and to pursue an asylum claim, Rachel said, but we need evidence of Ivan's corruption and abuses. Testimonies, documents, anything that can prove the threat is real. Scott nodded, relieved. We have some leads on Ivan's shady campaign contributions. If that ties in with threats to Elena, it should help, right? Rachel pursed her lips. Potentially. But these cases can be lengthy and complicated, especially if Ivan wields influence in US circles. We'll need unwavering support from you and your network. I'll do whatever it takes, Scott said firmly, even as he thought of Walter Gibson's looming threat and Penelope's mounting frustration. He couldn't let that stop him. Over the following days, Scott facilitated every resource Rachel requested. He used old contacts from his Bronx upbringing to gather any local knowledge about Ivan's associates. He leaned on Diane to coordinate with other non-profits that might have documented cases of abuse tied to Ivan's political circle. As the puzzle pieces came together, it felt like climbing a steep mountain. Each discovery offered hope, but the summit, true safety for Elena, remained distant. Meanwhile, the tension at Scott's company escalated. Walter circulated rumors of a potential board meeting to challenge Scott's leadership. The encryption product was nearing launch, and though Scott's team had it under control, the board wanted the CEO front and center. This forced him to juggle more than ever, corporate duties by day, clandestine planning with Rachel and Diane by night. Penelope, too, demanded answers. One evening, she confronted him in his penthouse. "I barely see you," she said, arms crossed. She looked elegant in an off-shoulder evening dress, as though she'd come from another high society function. "You miss calls, you skip events, and investors are whispering. When is this going to end?" Scott leaned against the kitchen counter, exhausted. "It will end when Elena and her baby are safe. This is real, Penelope. It's not some hobby I can drop." Her gaze hardened. "And what about us? The wedding? My mother is calling you an embarrassment. She thinks you're jeopardizing everything for some woman who vanished from your life decades ago." He felt a stab of guilt, not because he agreed, but because he knew his choices were pulling him away from the life they'd carefully curated. "I'm not asking you to understand everything, but I do need you to respect it." Penelope stared at him, her expression unreadable. After a long pause, she scoffed softly. "You're throwing away everything we've built. For what? A crusade?" He didn't respond, and that silence was answer enough. She left without another word, leaving him alone in the penthouse, burdened by the knowledge that his personal life was unraveling just as quickly as his professional one. But every time he thought of stepping back, he pictured Elena cradling April, eyes filled with fear, and any notion of quitting dissolved. On a Friday night, he went to see Elena at the shelter. She was seated in a small common room, feeding April a bottle. The baby's cheeks had filled out slightly from better nutrition, and the dark circles under Elena's eyes had faded somewhat. Seeing them this way brought a surge of emotion, relief that they were safer, but also worry over how fragile the peace remained. Elena glanced up. "Thank you for all this." Scott pulled up a worn chair next to hers. "I'm just sorry you had to go through so much alone," she sighed, her gaze distant. "I never thought I'd see you again. After everything in the Bronx, after my parents were deported, sometimes it feels like a dream." He gently reached for her free hand, and she let him hold it. "We'll get through this. Rachel is confident we have a strong case." But even as the words left his mouth, he felt the weight of the battle still ahead. Securing asylum would likely require a hearing, maybe multiple appeals. Ivan's men were still lurking somewhere, watching for a chance to corner Elena or sabotage Scott's efforts. And on top of that, the board's distrust threatened to strip him of the company he'd built. Scott, Elena's voice trembled, drawing him from his dark reverie. "Promise me you won't get hurt. I've already seen too many people suffer because of Ivan." He squeezed her hand. "I can't promise I won't get hurt, but I promise I won't run away." A faint, grateful smile touched her lips. April cooed softly, oblivious to the tense reality surrounding them. Outside the window, the New York streets buzzed with weekend life, a stark contrast to the quiet hush of the shelter. As he prepared to leave, Sister Kathleen approached with a concerned expression. "A man came by earlier, asking questions about a missing woman. We sent him away, but we fear it could happen again. We must remain vigilant." Scott nodded, steeling himself for the next phase of this journey. Every piece of progress they made drew them closer to a final confrontation, one where Ivan's threats, the board's scrutiny, and the question of Elena's legal status would collide. Still, as he stepped outside into the crisp night air, a determined resolve pulsed through his veins. The climb was steep, but he would not falter. Too many lives were at stake, and for once in his life he felt certain that this battle, no matter how risky, was the one he was meant to fight. A piercing January wind swept across Manhattan, rattling windows and forcing pedestrians to huddle deeper into their coats. High above the bustling streets, in Scott's penthouse apartment, a small group gathered around his polished walnut dining table. It was an unusual assembly. Diane Brooks from the Foundation, lawyer Rachel Castillo, Mateo, and Scott's private security consultant, a former military officer named Malcolm Reed. At the head of the table sat Scott himself, looking drawn but determined. Elena was not present. She and her daughter remained safely tucked away at the St. Luke's shelter, protected by a volunteer rotation. The group had convened to finalize a plan, one that would address both the immediate threat from Ivan and the urgent legal steps needed to secure Elena's asylum. Diane began the discussion, her gaze shifting between the others. "We all know what's at stake. Elena is willing to testify about Ivan's abuse and the political corruption she witnessed. If we do this correctly, it could fast-track her case. But it'll draw attention. Possibly the wrong kind." Rachel nodded, her tone measured. "Once we file the formal petition, her identity and circumstances become part of official records. Ivan's lawyers might try to discredit her or even claim she's lying to gain legal status. His team could push for an immediate hearing, and if they succeed in painting her as not credible, it could jeopardize everything." Scott's jaw tensed. "What if we counter that by going public? Expose Ivan's corruption. Show the world Elena's plight so there's too much scrutiny for him to bury the case," Malcolm interjected, his posture straight as a rod. "Going public is a double-edged sword. Yes, it brings attention, but it also risks making Elena and April even bigger targets. Ivan has resources, and he won't hesitate to retaliate." A heavy silence fell. Each of them understood the precarious balance they walked. Finally, Mateo spoke, his voice low. "I've been talking to women in the community. Some encountered Ivan's associates, threats, bribes to reveal Elena's whereabouts. It's getting worse. If we wait too long, they might find her anyway." Scott raked his fingers through his hair, frustration evident. "We need to move forward. I can't just sit back and watch these threats pile up." Rachel exchanged a glance with Diane. "Then the next step is filing the petition immediately. We have enough evidence of ongoing danger. We'll also request an emergency protective order, but Elena must be prepared to speak with the authorities and face Ivan in a legal setting." That last part hung in the air. While Elena had agreed in principle, Scott knew how terrified she was. The memory of her tearful admission, "I'm so tired. I just want April to be safe," echoed in his mind. Still, the law required her testimony. Diane placed a reassuring hand on Scott's arm. I'll talk to her again, make sure she feels supported. We'll have an advocate by her side 24/7. Scott's phone, resting on the table, lit up with an incoming call. The screen showed Walter Gibson. A wave of irritation washed over him. Walter rarely called after office hours unless it was urgent. Scott debated ignoring it, but the others gave him a nod to go ahead. He answered with a clipped greeting. Walter's voice crackled through, tense and agitated. "Scott, we have a problem. Several board members have heard rumors you're about to be embroiled in a major legal fight. Something about a scandal with a Mexican official. They're calling an emergency session in 2 days to discuss your position as CEO." Scott closed his eyes, inhaling sharply. "Walter, I'm in the middle of something important. Can't this wait?" "No," Walter snapped. "It can't. You think your personal crusade is separate from company affairs, but you're wrong. Fix this or step aside. The board won't risk a meltdown over your entanglements." The call ended abruptly. Scott set the phone down, a hollow feeling in his chest. It was a stark reminder that while he fought for Elena, forces within his own company were rallying against him. He summarized Walter's message for the group, prompting anxious looks. Diane sighed. "You'll have to handle that crisis too, but if we delay Elena's legal moves, we might lose momentum, and she might lose her last window of safety." Scott nodded, his eyes reflecting both exhaustion and resolve. "I can handle the board. I have to. But I'm not abandoning Elena. We file the petition tomorrow. No more waiting." A sense of urgency rippled through the room. Malcolm agreed to beef up security at St. Luke's and at the Foundation, while Matteo promised to coordinate volunteers to watch for suspicious activity around the shelter. Rachel would draft the final paperwork overnight. Diane would help Elena prepare for what came next. And Scott, he would walk into the boardroom battle, uncertain whether he'd emerge with his title intact. But some battles, he reminded himself, are worth fighting regardless of the personal cost. As the group dispersed into the cold Manhattan night, the stage was set for the coming storm. The threads of Scott's life, his corporate empire, Elena's safety, Ivan's looming threats, were about to collide. He closed the door behind them, taking a moment to absorb the gravity of it all. The supreme test lay ahead, to protect the woman he loved from a past he once failed to shield her from, even if it meant risking everything he'd built since then. The morning sun cast long shadows across the old stone facade of New York's federal courthouse. Rachel Castillo guided Elena through the security checkpoint, where uniformed officers ran their IDs through scanners. Scott and Diane followed closely, each carrying a quiet determination. For Elena, this was her first tentative step into a formal legal space since arriving back in the United States. Her pale face revealed a mixture of fear and courage. They moved into a hallway, lined with wooden benches. Scott could sense Elena's tension in the way she cradled April, pressing the baby gently against her chest. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone here." She offered a trembling nod, glancing around at the flurry of attorneys and clients. Diane leaned closer to Elena. "Stay calm. Rachel knows the process. Just answer questions honestly." Inside the small hearing room, the air felt thick with anticipation. Rachel had arranged for a preliminary session with a judge, presenting evidence that Elena was in immediate danger and required protective status. Ivan was not present. He had sent his attorney instead, a sleek, sharp-dressed man with an air of practiced confidence. The sight of him made Elena's breath hitch. The judge, a woman in her 50s with an even gaze, acknowledged everyone and began. Rachel rose and introduced Elena's situation. She spoke of Ivan's documented threats, the pending corruption investigations, and Elena's previous attempts to seek help. As she talked, Elena held April close, trying not to tremble. It was the first time her story had been told so openly in an official setting. When Rachel finished, Ivan's lawyer stood. My client strongly denies any misconduct. Mrs. Martinez is simply trying to manipulate U.S. immigration law by defaming a respected politician. He offered a stack of papers. We have affidavits claiming Ms. Martinez has a history of exaggeration. She was once deported, after all. Scott, seated with Diane, a row behind Elena, clenched his fists. The mention of Elena's deportation stung, reminding him how powerless they both once were. He exchanged a glance with Diane, who whispered, "Stay calm." Rachel launched a rebuttal, pointing out contradictions in Ivan's affidavits and emphasizing Elena's fear for her life. She highlighted specific incidents, including bruises and hospital records from Mexico, damning pieces of evidence. The lawyer for Ivan tried to object, but the judge waved him off, wanting to see all documentation. After nearly 2 hours of back and forth, the judge spoke. Given the urgency of these allegations, I will grant Ms. Martinez temporary protective status while we investigate further. She must remain accessible to this court. The child, April, shall also be under this court's protection. She looked gravely at Ivan's lawyer. Any evidence of interference or harassment will be taken seriously. Relief swept through the room like a collective sigh. Elena closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. She'd won a small but vital victory. The court acknowledged her peril enough to shield her, at least for now. Rachel thanked the judge, and Ivan's lawyer glowered, collecting his files before striding out. Outside in the corridor, Elena visibly shook with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. Scott reached out, gently touching her arm. "We did it. It's not over, but this is a big step." She nodded, cradling April. "Thank you. Thank you all." Diane smiled softly. "We keep going. Next, we gather more proof. We show the judge that Ivan is a real threat." Just then, Scott's phone buzzed with an urgent text from his assistant at the office. Walter requested an emergency board meeting for tomorrow, 9 a.m. sharp. His heart sank. The board meeting he'd dreaded was finally happening, and he suspected it would be anything but friendly. After a quick explanation to Diane and Elena, he stepped aside to place a call to Malcolm, his security consultant. "We need to ensure Elena's safe house remains confidential," Scott said, pacing near a window that overlooked the courthouse steps. "Ivan's lawyer lost this round, and we can't risk retaliation." Malcolm promised to tighten measures, and Diane offered to stay close to Elena. Rachel, satisfied with the outcome for the day, agreed that Elena should return to St. Luke's under security until they could arrange long-term shelter. They would need to prepare for the full asylum hearing, which could be months away. By late afternoon, Scott, exhausted but determined, escorted Elena back to the waiting car. As they drove toward the shelter, Elena gazed out at the bustling streets. "I was so scared," she admitted softly. "But hearing that judge recognize what I've been through, it gave me hope." "That hope is yours to keep," Scott replied, though he felt the same flicker of hope overshadowed by the creeping dread of the upcoming board showdown. Today, he had watched Elena stand up to a system designed to intimidate her, and she'd survived it. Tomorrow, he would step into a boardroom to face a different kind of intimidation, one that threatened to strip away his position and influence. For now, though, Elena and April had a shield of legal protection. It wasn't a final victory, but it was a profound step forward. As the car turned down a familiar Queens side street, Scott took a last glance at Elena's resolute expression and realized something fundamental. The courage she'd shown today reminded him of the raw determination that first drew him to her in the Bronx so many years ago. He promised himself silently that he would match her bravery, whatever the next day demanded. Early the next morning, Scott found himself standing before a floor-to-ceiling mirror in his penthouse bedroom. adjusting the cuffs of a crisp navy suit. He'd rarely felt so uneasy about entering his own company's boardroom. Usually, such meetings were routine, updates on quarterly earnings, product roadmaps, or strategic initiatives. But today's emergency session was different. It was personal. His reflections stared back with tense features, a reminder of the emotional storms that had been brewing for weeks. If he lost this confrontation, the fallout could be devastating. Not just for him, but for Elena and April as well. Without his title and influence, helping them could become infinitely harder. He arrived at the company's skyscraper and rode the elevator to the top floor, each ding intensifying his heartbeat. At the executive suite, he passed employees who offered polite but worried smiles. They all knew something was amiss. Word traveled fast when a CEO's leadership was in question. Inside the boardroom, members gathered around an elongated table of polished glass. Walter, Paula Green, the CFO, Simon Lee, and several others. Penelope's mother, Sylvia Middleton, an influential shareholder from her family's fortune, stood by the window, talking quietly with Penelope herself. Scott inhaled sharply, not missing the disapproving flick of Sylvia's gaze. Walter was the first to break the silence, gesturing for Scott to take a seat at the head of the table. "We have serious matters to address," he began in a flat tone. "Scott, your recent actions have raised significant concerns. We understand you have personal obligations, but as CEO, your primary duty is to protect the company and its shareholders." Scott cleared his throat, trying to maintain composure. "I won't deny I've taken a personal interest in a legal case involving an old friend, but it hasn't interfered with our product launch or revenue streams. In fact, the new encryption platform is on schedule." Paula leaned forward. "That's true, but investor confidence is shaken by reports linking you to a political scandal. We've even received inquiries from potential partners who worry about negative press." "Reports are exaggerated," Scott insisted. "My involvement is humanitarian. I'm helping a domestic violence survivor and her child. Where's the scandal in that?" Sylvia stepped away from the window, her voice dripping with disdain. "Your so-called humanitarian act is overshadowed by the fact that this woman's ex-husband is an influential politician. Scandal sells, Mr. Morris, and you're giving the media an open door." Penelope, seated beside her mother, remained silent, though her tense expression spoke volumes. She hadn't told him Sylvia would attend, and he wondered if this was a coordinated effort to pressure him. Walter slid a folder across the table. "Let's talk finances. Rumors say you've allocated substantial personal funds to this cause. Some wonder if you're using company resources as well." Scott shot him a hard look. "I have not used company money. My donations come from my personal accounts. That's my prerogative." Simon Lee cleared his throat. "Look, no one here wants to oust you hastily, but we must ensure you remain fully committed to the company. With the encryption product about to go global, any instability could sink our stock prices." Scott felt a surge of adrenaline. This wasn't just about money. It was about leveraging moral fear to keep him in line. He squared his shoulders. "Let me remind everyone that I built this company from the ground up. I've always acted in its best interest. I'm not reckless enough to harm my own creation." Walter's lips formed a thin line. "Then prove it. We propose a formal motion. You will step back from public association with this legal case until after the product launch and pending partnerships are secured. If you refuse, we have the authority to vote on suspending you as CEO." The ultimatum hung in the air, echoing in the sudden quiet. Scott's gaze flicked around the table. Most board members avoided his eyes, clearly uncomfortable. Penelope's stare was downcast, her fingers twisting the edge of a notepad. Even she wouldn't speak on his behalf. Sylvia Middleton watched with a faint smirk. At that moment, he realized the painful truth. Many around this table valued profit above all else. His personal crusade, to them, was an inconvenient moral tangent. Bile rose in his throat. He steadied his breathing and spoke calmly. "I appreciate your concerns, but I won't be coerced into abandoning someone in danger. I can manage my responsibilities here and still help Elena Martinez." Walter leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "Then we'll take a vote, for or against suspension." The tension tightened like a coiled spring. Paula and Simon exchanged uncertain glances, while Sylvia announced she was in favor of suspension. Penelope's eyes flicked to Scott for a split second, then she stared at her lap. In that moment, Scott realized he might lose. Anger, disappointment, and a strange clarity flooded him. If they forced him out, he'd find another way. This wasn't about clinging to a title. It was about standing for something that mattered. He braced himself, ready for the worst. The vote began. Walter, Sylvia, and a couple of others raised their hands for suspension. Paula and Simon hesitated, looking torn. A few members, loyal from the company's early days, voted to keep him. The Count teetered on the brink of removing him, until Simon slowly, reluctantly, sided with Scott. Paula, too, gave a nod of support. Walter frowned deeply. "By a narrow margin, you keep your position. But consider this your final warning, Scott. If anything happens that disrupts our launch or tarnishes this company's name, we will revisit this vote, and it won't be in your favor." A restless shuffle spread around the table. Meeting adjourned, most hurried out, eager to escape the strain. Penelope exited without a word, trailing after her mother. Walter lingered, scowling at Scott. Then he left as well. Scott stood alone, the city skyline framed in the boardroom's glass walls. He had survived the vote, but just barely. In the polished reflection of the window, he saw his shoulders slumped under the weight of so many burdens. Today felt like staring into a mirror, revealing parts of himself he rarely acknowledged, his unwavering need to do the right thing, even at severe personal risk. And as he left the silent boardroom, he accepted that the storm was only intensifying. The greatest test was yet to come, not just in legal battles or corporate showdowns, but in facing himself and his deepest fears. Scott stepped out onto the bustling sidewalk outside his office tower, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The board meeting had left him drained, but also fiercely determined. Having narrowly avoided suspension, he felt the ticking clock of an ultimatum. If any scandal broke or the product launch faltered, he'd be out, and so would his ability to protect Elena. While weaving through lunchtime crowds, his phone buzzed. Glancing down, he saw a message from Diane. "Emergency at the shelter. Elena very upset. Ivan's men might have found a clue to her location." Scott's pulse quickened. He flagged down a cab, heart hammering in his chest. Within half an hour, he was at St. Luke's, rushing down the worn corridor. Sister Kathleen met him, her expression grim. "Elena's in the common area. She's shaken up, says someone was watching her while she walked with April in the courtyard." He found Elena sitting in a wooden chair, trembling, clutching April protectively. Her eyes brimmed with tears. Nearby, Diane and Matteo stood, trying to comfort her. A single caretaker hovered anxiously. "Elena, what happened?" Scott asked, kneeling beside her. She swallowed hard, eyes darting to the shelter's door. "I needed fresh air for the baby. We went into the courtyard. Then I saw, I'm sure it was Arturo, Ivan's right-hand man. He was across the street, just staring at us. I ran inside." Scott clenched his jaw. "We can't stay here if he knows. Malcolm's men are supposed to be guarding the perimeter, but obviously we need a new plan." Diane nodded. "I've already called Malcolm. He's sending more security, but maybe it's time to move Elena somewhere safer." Matteo stepped forward. "I know a secure temporary housing unit in Brooklyn that a local church uses for special cases. Very few people know about it. We could bring Elena and April there." Elena met Scott's gaze, her voice shaky. "I'm scared, but I'll go anywhere if it keeps April safe." Scott squeezed her hand gently. "We'll handle the details. Let me make some calls." He stepped into the hallway, phone in hand, contacting Malcolm and coordinating with Rachel about the legal implications of relocating Elena. All the while, a swirl of conflicting thoughts flooded him. Anger at Ivan's relentless harassment, worry about the board's next move, and fear for Elena's immediate safety. This situation was escalating faster than he had anticipated. Within an hour, a private van arrived, driven by one of Malcolm's trusted men. Elena, gripping April close, followed Diane into the vehicle. Scott hopped in beside them, every sense on high alert. Matteo climbed into a second car behind them, ready to run interference if anyone followed. The ride to Brooklyn was tense, the city streets passing in a blur of traffic and towering buildings. Elena, pale and silent, stared at April's tiny face, occasionally pressing a kiss to her baby's forehead. Scott reached over to place a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll get through this," he murmured, though a knot of dread coiled in his stomach. Eventually, the van pulled up to a small brownstone nestled between larger apartment complexes. The curtains were drawn, and a discreet side entrance led to a partially finished basement apartment. Inside, there were 2 rooms, a modest bedroom and a living area with a kitchenette. It was no penthouse, but it offered anonymity. Diane inspected the rooms, nodding approval. "This will do for now. It's a stopgap, but at least it's off the radar." Elena settled onto the small couch, letting out a shaky breath. April fussed, sensing her mother's unease. Scott found a carton of baby formula in the bag they'd brought and handed it to Elena, who prepared a bottle with unsteady hands. While Elena fed April, Scott and Diane spoke in hushed tones at the kitchenette counter. "Ivan isn't going to stop," Scott said, voice low. "He's determined to force her back or punish her for leaving him." Diane nodded gravely. "We'll keep rotating security. I'll update Rachel about the new address. She'll inform the judge if needed." The door to the basement opened as Malcolm entered, scanning the rooms with a professional air. "Perimeter seems clear. I've got 2 men posted outside. One in the alley, another in a car on the next block." Scott offered a tight smile of thanks. "I appreciate it." Malcolm gave him a pointed look. "It's not just Elena's safety at stake. We need to think about your own exposure. If Ivan's man is tailing you, he might try something more direct." A surge of stubborn resolve rose in Scott. "I'll handle that risk. My priority is making sure Elena and April stay out of his reach." As the evening wore on, the group gradually dispersed. Diane left to handle foundation business, Malcolm to coordinate the extended security detail. Matteo would bring supplies the next day. Finally, Scott and Elena found themselves alone in the small living area, the overhead light casting a warm glow. Elena's voice broke the silence. "Thank you for all of this. I know it's not easy." He sat beside her on the worn couch, exhaustion etched into his features. "I want you to be free of this nightmare," he said softly. "That's all that matters." She reached for his hand, a fragile smile crossing her face. They sat that way a while, April cradled between them, the muffled hum of Brooklyn's nightlife outside. In that fragile moment, they found a semblance of peace, though they both sensed that a final, more perilous confrontation with Ivan loomed. This was the last calm before the storm's fiercest gust, and each breath they took felt like borrowed time. 2 days later, the morning sky was a dull gray, threatening snow. In the cramped basement apartment, Elena paced with April cradled in her arms, her nerves on edge. Scott had just stepped outside to make a call to Rachel, giving Elena a moment alone. She glanced at the door every few seconds, her heart drumming. Staying indoors day and night gnawed at her spirit, but stepping out risked discovery. When Scott returned, his brow was furrowed. Rachel says Ivan's attorney filed a motion claiming we fabricated evidence. They want to accelerate the court date. It could happen as soon as next week. Elena felt her stomach lurch. But that means I'll have to face him, doesn't it? Scott nodded, crossing the room to gently stroke April's cheek. Yes, but you'll have legal protection. We'll have more evidence by then. Rachel believes the judge won't buy Ivan's story if we can present solid testimony from you and potentially other witnesses. She sank onto the couch, feeling the weight of her past close in. I still can't believe I have to stand in front of him again. We won't let him intimidate you, Scott promised. This time, you're not alone. A tentative knock sounded on the door, making them both tense. Scott exchanged a look with Elena before peering through the peephole. It was Penelope. He hesitated, uncertain. Finally, he opened the door. Penelope stepped inside, looking out of place in her designer coat and heels against the backdrop of peeling paint and worn furniture. Her gaze landed on Elena and the baby. A flicker of surprise or discomfort crossed her features. I had to see this for myself, she said quietly, her voice lacking its usual polished confidence. Scott forced a calm tone. Penelope, how did you find us? She exhaled, crossing her arms protectively. I asked around the foundation until someone slipped the address. Don't worry, I didn't bring a horde of reporters. Elena eyed her warily, sensing tension. April squirmed in her arms. Scott placed a reassuring hand on Elena's shoulder, then turned to Penelope. Why are you here? Penelope took in the sight of the baby, then the tight lines of Elena's face. I wanted to understand what's been pulling you away, and maybe I wanted to see if it's really as dire as you say. Elena's voice trembled with anger. Dire? I'm hiding in a basement from a man who beat me and threatened my child. Do you need more proof? Penelope colored slightly, glancing away. I'm not your enemy, she murmured. Look, it's obvious Scott cares about you. But the situation is complicated. Elena bristled but said nothing, stepping back to rock April gently. Scott cleared his throat. Penelope, if you're worried about the board, they've already tried to remove me once. I'm still here. If this is about our engagement, she cut him off. It's about more than that. Yes, my mother is furious. The investors are on edge. But I see now that this is real. It's not some fleeting charity project. Her gaze flicked to Elena's bruised arms, faded but still visible. Something in Penelope's expression softened. Minutes of awkward silence followed. At last, Penelope inhaled, summoning a steadier voice. I can't pretend to be entirely supportive, but I won't stand in the way, not anymore. Do what you have to do, Scott. I'm stepping aside. Elena cast a questioning look at Scott, who simply exhaled a heavy breath. Thank you, he said, his tone subdued, as if mourning the end of something that was never built on genuine love anyway. Penelope, blinking rapidly, headed for the door. Before leaving, she turned and spoke to Elena. I hope you get the justice you deserve. She didn't wait for a reply, closing the door behind her with a soft click. In the tense quiet that followed, Elena sagged onto the couch, relief and sorrow mingling in her eyes. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't mean to ruin your... Scott shook his head. There was nothing to ruin. We weren't together for the right reasons. He knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. Let's focus on keeping you and April safe. Later that afternoon, Diane arrived with more news. Ivan's men have been spotted near the foundation again, she warned. We're telling everyone to stay vigilant. Rachel wants to expedite new evidence to the court, Elena nodded, setting April down in a makeshift crib. "I'll do whatever it takes. I'm tired of hiding." Scott glanced out the narrow basement window, watching flakes of snow begin to drift. "I know you are," he said softly. "We're nearing the breaking point. Once this hearing is set, we either confront Ivan head-on or risk losing everything." Diane looked between them, determination shining in her eyes. "Then we confront him. The legal system is on our side if we can gather the right evidence. And we have moral truth. He's the abuser, the criminal. We just need to show the world." In the distance, sirens wailed, mingling with the muffled hum of Brooklyn's streets. Scott gently rubbed his temples, mentally preparing for what lay ahead. The hearing would be a crucible. Ivan would likely appear, pulling every string he had to discredit Elena, and by extension, Scott. The board was hovering like vultures, ready to pounce if a whisper of scandal tainted the company's upcoming launch. And Penelope's exit from his life, though inevitable, added its own layer of emotional strain. Yet the more the walls seemed to close in, the more Scott felt a sense of unwavering resolve. He remembered Elena's tearful eyes when they first reunited on Fifth Avenue, her face drawn with desperation. He recalled how a single glance through a car window had reignited feelings he thought he'd buried under corporate ambition. Now he stood on the brink of a final showdown, against Ivan, against the board, against his own past failings. Elena gently placed a hand over his. "Thank you for standing by me," she whispered, "for believing in me." Scott squeezed her hand back, looking into her eyes. "I always believed in you. I just lost my way. But I'm here now." As snow gathered on the basement window, they sat quietly, drawing strength from the companionship they had rediscovered. The next steps were fraught with risk, but in that small, hidden room, their unity felt like a light piercing the gloom. Soon, they would step into the courthouse for the battle that would decide their future. They were ready to face the storm, together. The day of Elena's final court hearing arrived sooner than anyone expected. Dawn broke over the city, washing the streets in a pale winter light. In the cramped Brooklyn apartment that had become their refuge, Elena clutched April in her arms, heart pounding at the thought of standing before a judge, and Ivan once more. Scott paced by the window, phone in hand. He'd just ended a tense call with Rachel Castillo. "She's on her way to the courthouse," he told Elena, voice subdued. "Diane and Mateo will meet us there too." Malcolm's security team is stationed outside. A swirl of emotions filled the room. Elena dressed April in a tiny pink sweater, checking each button as if it were armor against the unknown. "What if the judge doesn't believe me? Or if Ivan bribes someone?" Scott moved closer, placing a reassuring hand on Elena's shoulder. "Rachel has the evidence lined up, medical records, eyewitness accounts, and Diane got statements from 2 other women who escaped Ivan's circle. Stay strong, we're ready." Despite his confident words, a knot of anxiety tightened in Scott's stomach. Not only was he about to help Elena confront the man who terrorized her for years, but his own corporate empire still balanced on a knife's edge. One whisper of controversy might embolden the board to oust him, no matter the temporary reprieve he'd earned. Even so, his resolve to protect Elena stood firm. They arrived at the courthouse in a single black SUV, escorted by 2 of Malcolm's security personnel. Stepping out into the chilly air, Elena held April close while scanning the grey stone facade. Though tension radiated from her, she straightened her back, preparing to face her abuser in a final bid for freedom. Inside, they found Diane and Mateo in a corridor buzzing with lawyers, clients, and court clerks. Diane greeted Elena with a gentle hug. "We're here," she said softly. "All of us. You'll be okay." Rachel appeared moments later, briefcase in hand, her expression focused. "We've been assigned to courtroom 4B. Ivan's attorney is already inside. Let's go. The group moved down the hall. Malcolm stationed one guard by the door to keep watch. Elena's grip on April tightened. Each step closer to the courtroom felt like wading into deeper water. At last, they passed through the heavy wooden doors and took seats near the front. The judge, a middle-aged woman with steel-grey hair, presided from a raised bench. Rows of spectators, many of them strangers, filled the pew-like benches behind the legal teams. Ivan sat at the defendant's table, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his expression cold and confident. Seeing him sent a visible shudder through Elena. Scott reached over and gently touched her arm. "I'm right here." As proceedings began, Rachel methodically laid out the case for Elena's asylum request. She recounted the abuse, supported by hospital reports and statements from other victims who described Ivan's political connections and intimidation tactics. The judge listened with an impassive face, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When Ivan's lawyer rose, his voice carried a suave edge. He accused Elena of lying, insisting she was simply manipulating the system to remain in the United States. He presented documents attempting to cast doubt on her character, claiming she had faked injuries and exaggerated the fear of harm. Throughout his speech, Ivan stared at Elena, a predatory glint in his eyes. Then came the moment everyone dreaded, Elena's testimony. Summoning every ounce of courage, she stood at the witness stand, April left in Diane's arms. Her voice quavered at first, but as she recounted instances of physical violence and threats to her family, her resolve seemed to solidify. Tears welled but did not fall. She spoke of the sleepless nights, the constant dread, and the final act of desperation that forced her to flee, even if it meant living on the streets with her infant daughter. When Ivan's lawyer attempted to rattle her with aggressive questioning, implying she only wanted financial gain, she met his gaze with surprising steadiness. "You cannot buy safety," she said quietly. "I just want to protect my daughter." A hush fell over the courtroom. Even the judge seemed moved by Elena's stark sincerity. Ivan shifted in his seat, his carefully curated mask cracking for a brief instant. Rachel then introduced new evidence, a witness statement from a former colleague of Ivan's who had overheard him boast about controlling judges in Mexico. The statement implied Ivan's capacity for corruption extended across borders. The judge studied the document intently, her expression darkening. Finally, the judge asked both sides to summarize. Ivan's attorney repeated his standard denial. Rachel reiterated Elena's need for protection and asked the court to uphold her asylum claim. The judge announced she would render a decision shortly. The tension was palpable as they all stepped outside the courtroom to wait. Diane cradled April while Elena stood trembling, leaning against a wall. Scott took her hand. "You were incredible in there," he said. "The judge saw the truth." Elena closed her eyes, exhaling in a rush of pent-up emotion. "I hope so." "I can't go back, Scott. I can't live like that again." He squeezed her hand gently, feeling an unexpected sense of unity with her. "You won't. Not if I have anything to say about it." Minutes later, a clerk summoned them back. Hearts pounding, they re-entered the courtroom. The judge's measured gaze swept across the assembled parties. Then, in a clear, firm tone, she pronounced that Elena's application for asylum was granted, citing credible fear of violence and political corruption. For a moment, it seemed time stopped. Elena staggered with relief, tears breaking free. Scott wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. Diane and Mateo exchanged jubilant smiles. Even Rachel looked momentarily overcome by emotion. Ivan rose abruptly, face contorted with rage, and began barking objections. But the judge slammed her gavel, warning him to respect the court's decision or face contempt. Chaos ensued as reporters, alerted by some tip, spilled into the hallway. Elena, cradling April again, clung to Scott's arm as Malcolm's guards moved to shield them. The final storm had broken, and they stood in its eye, but this time the law was on their side, and at least for the moment, Ivan's power had been diminished by the truth. As they navigated the crowded exit, Elena looked at Scott with tear-filled eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." He felt his own eyes burn with unshed tears. "We did this together," he replied, heart pounding with equal parts relief and triumph. For the first time in a long while, he felt that he truly kept his promise to protect her from injustice, no matter the cost. A swirl of cameras followed them from the courthouse, but Malcolm's security team ensured Elena, April, and the rest of the group reached their vehicles unharmed. By the time they drove away, adrenaline pulsed through everyone's veins, tempered by an overwhelming sense of relief. Elena's new legal status meant she no longer had to hide in shadows. Scott insisted they all regroup at Diane's foundation building in Queens. The moment they walked into the humble yet welcoming space, the staff erupted in cheers. Women who had once been in Elena's situation gathered around, some wiping away tears, others offering warm embraces. Elena stood amidst them, at first shy, then succumbing to a cascade of thank yous and heartfelt sobs. Matteo spread the good news by phone and social media among trusted circles. Within an hour, donations poured in from sympathetic supporters who saw Elena's victory as a beacon of hope in a system that often felt stacked against the vulnerable. Meanwhile, Scott lingered near the reception desk, quietly checking his phone for company messages. Although he'd done his best to manage the product launch from a distance, he couldn't fully ignore the board's discontent. The sense of dread he'd felt before the court hearing bubbled up again. What if the next message is from Walter, demanding an explanation for the media circus? But for now, he tucked the phone away, deciding to savor this triumph. Diane found him gazing into space. "You look tired," she said softly, "but I also see relief." "I'm exhausted," he admitted with a half-smile, "yet I've never felt more alive. Elena's free, finally." Diane placed a hand on his shoulder. "And don't forget what that means for other women, too. Cases like hers show the system can work if we push hard enough." He nodded, a surge of gratitude swelling in his chest. "You're the one who taught me how—" "Thank you." They were interrupted by Elena's voice calling his name. She stood a few feet away, April propped on her hip, wearing a smile that reached her tired eyes. Could we step outside for some air?" Together, they walked out into the late afternoon sun. A cool breeze rustled the bare tree branches lining the sidewalk. They found a bench near a modest community garden behind the foundation building. Elena sat down, carefully placing April on her lap. "I still can't believe it," she murmured, her gaze drifting to the passing cars. "I keep expecting someone to say the judge changed her mind." Scott gently covered her free hand with his. "It's real." No more living in fear, she exhaled, a tremor of emotion rippling through her. "So much has happened. I can't just snap my fingers and forget everything." "That's normal," he said quietly. "Healing takes time. But now you have the chance to do it in peace." Elena's eyes grew distant. "I don't even know where to start. Find a job, an apartment for me and April, talk to my parents in Mexico. I've barely spoken to them since the deportation." Scott studied her face. "We can figure it out together. There's a place for you at the foundation if you want to help other women, or I can connect you with programs that assist new immigrants. Anything you need." She looked down at April, who was busy grabbing at a loose thread on her sweater. "And you, Scott? Your company, your life, it's all so different now. Are you going to be okay after all this?" A wave of uncertainty washed over him. "I'm not sure. The board could still come after me." But I'm more prepared to handle it now than I was before. If they force me out, I'll figure something else out. I'm not tied to that place the way I used to be, not anymore." Elena bit her lip, hesitating. "I don't want you to lose everything because of me." He shook his head firmly. "Don't ever say that. I made my choices freely, and I'd make them again. I never want to be that powerless kid who watched you leave without fighting to keep you safe." Tears pooled in her eyes, but she held them back. "You've changed, you know." Scott gazed at her, remembering how they once strolled together in the Bronx streets as teenagers. "So have you," he whispered, his heart twisting at both the sorrow and hope in her expression. They sat in companionable silence a while, soaking in the crisp air. For the first time since their reunion on Fifth Avenue, their world felt open and unguarded. April cooed, distracted by a fluttering bird overhead, oblivious to the struggles that had shaped her first months of life. Finally, Elena stood, carefully balancing April in her arms. "I want to visit my parents," she said, determination in her voice. "Maybe bring them here if I can. After all this, I want my family whole again." Scott rose with her, placing a gentle hand at her back. "We'll do it, Elena, step by step." As they walked back inside, the Foundation staff cheered again, this time for them both. The bond they'd forged, equal parts past love, shared sacrifice and renewed hope, shone like an invisible thread linking their lives. Though the path ahead still had obstacles, this moment was theirs, a quiet victory, a long road home, but one they would travel side by side. 3 days after Elena's court triumph, Scott was in his office, meeting with a handful of employees. Though the board had made ominous noises about convening again, no official move had been made to oust him. Yet, in the meantime, he used his position to advocate for corporate social responsibility programs, inspired by his experiences with the Foundation. He proposed a new initiative to provide grants and technical support to non-profits working with refugees and domestic abuse survivors. The employees, mostly younger hires, seemed enthused. One of them, a bright-eyed programmer named Kelsey, said she'd always wanted to volunteer but didn't know how. Another, from marketing, suggested creating a corporate partnership with New Beginnings Foundation to funnel resources more effectively. Walter, who had stomped into the room midway through the meeting, eyed the presentation slides with a pinched expression. "We're a tech company, not a charity. The board won't approve any major budget shifts unless it sees direct ROI." Scott met his gaze calmly. "The brand image alone is worth the investment. Plus, our employees want meaningful engagement. If we ignore that, we'll lose talent." Walter seemed unconvinced, muttering something about reckless idealism, but he refrained from further confrontation in front of the staff. Scott recognized this was only a temporary reprieve. Still, the seeds were planted. If the board did push him out, at least he'd leave, having sparked change. After the meeting, he returned to his desk, phone already buzzing. It was Elena, her voice brimming with excitement. "I just found a small apartment, Scott. Diane helped me apply. It's in a community housing complex here in Queens. They approved me." A broad grin lit his face. "That's amazing. When can you move in?" "They said by the end of the week," she replied, her tone light, almost giddy. "It's not big, but it's ours. April will have a real roof, a real home." "Count me in for moving day," Scott said warmly. "And anything else you need? Furniture, groceries, whatever." Elena's voice grew soft. "Thank you. I never imagined feeling normal again." They ended the call, and Scott took a moment to relish the simplicity of Elena's happiness. Just a few weeks ago, she was begging on the street. Now she was about to have a place she could call her own. His chest tightened with emotion, relief, pride, and a quiet sense of victory. No matter what happened next at the company, this was worth it. Later that afternoon, Diane arranged a small celebration at the foundation. Women who had gone through hellish experiences gathered to share their stories of survival, each tale layered with pain and resilience. Elena stood before them, April dozing in a sling across her chest, and spoke hesitantly at first, but soon found her stride. She recounted her journey from a fearful teen deported alongside her family, to a wife trapped in abuse, to a mother running from violence. The room listened in rapt silence. "I thought I had no future," Elena said, voice thick with emotion, "but good people found me and didn't give up. Even when I tried to vanish, they brought me back to life." Applause rang out, some women wiping tears, others nodding in understanding. Scott stood at the back, his own eyes damp. He recalled the day he first saw Elena on Fifth Avenue, how her gaze had jolted him into action. They'd come so far, yet the journey had only just begun. When Elena finished, she spotted Scott and motioned for him to step forward. Heat rose to his cheeks. He preferred the background, but as he joined her, the crowd clapped again. She gave a small laugh. "This is Scott, the one who found me and helped me believe in second chances." A flush of self-consciousness battled with gratitude. "I don't need applause," he said into the microphone. "Elena did all the hard work, but I want to say, if you have the ability to help someone, do it. It's worth every risk, every sleepless night, to see someone stand on their feet again." The crowd erupted once more, and in that moment, Scott felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Whatever the board decided, he couldn't regret a single decision. His own transformation, from an obsessive CEO fixated on metrics to someone who recognized the power of empathy, felt complete. After the event, Elena and April walked with him down the street, the winter sun dipping low. Elena paused in front of a corner bakery. "Can we get cupcakes for the apartment?" she asked, eyes gleaming. "Something to celebrate. April's first real home." Scott's laugh came easily. "Absolutely." They strolled inside, selecting a box of frosted treats. The cashier smiled at April, who squealed in delight at the colorful icing. Stepping back onto the sidewalk, Elena gripped the box and turned to Scott. "How about you? Ready to face whatever comes next?" He nodded, inhaling the crisp air. "I am. The board can do what they want. I have no regrets." For a second, they simply looked at one another, a quiet warmth passing between them. Then, with April securely cradled, they headed toward the new apartment, cupcakes in hand, a small symbol of the sweet, if fragile, promise of a life rebuilt. A week later, in early evening, Scott stood by a freshly assembled crib in Elena's new one-bedroom apartment. The walls were plain white, the floors scuffed, but the smell of fresh paint lingered like a hopeful sign of beginnings. A soft lullaby played from a small speaker, and April cooed from inside the crib, big eyes wandering the unfamiliar room. Elena busied herself unpacking dishes in the adjacent kitchenette, wearing an old sweater that once belonged to her mother. She called it her lucky charm. Outside, the muffled city sounds drifted through a slightly open window where dusk had settled over Queens. Stepping into the kitchenette, Scott began arranging cups on a shelf. "We should have a housewarming party," he joked, "though I doubt you want a crowd just yet." Elena let out a light laugh. "Soon. For now, I'm just enjoying the quiet. It's been so long since I felt safe." He gently closed the cabinet. "You're not worried about Ivan anymore." Her smile faded, replaced by a thoughtful look. "I won't lie. I'm still cautious. But with the court ruling and the new protective order, plus your security measures, it's the first time I can breathe without looking over my shoulder." Scott nodded, reflecting on the surreal shift in both their lives. His phone buzzed, a reminder of a late-night conference call he had to join about the encryption product launch. No new threats had materialized from the board, largely because the product was set for a successful release, promising hefty returns. Walter's warnings lingered, but for the moment they remained just that, warnings. He flipped the phone to silent. Work could wait. Tonight was about celebrating small victories. As if on cue, a knock sounded at the door. Diane and Matteo appeared, carrying a bag of groceries and a bouquet of simple daisies. "Welcome home," Diane said with a wide smile. "We thought you might need some essentials. Milk, bread, coffee." Elena beamed, taking the groceries. "You have no idea how perfect that is. I still haven't gone grocery shopping." Matteo presented the daisies shyly. "For you, white flowers symbolize new beginnings, right?" Elena's eyes misted. "They're beautiful. Thank you." While Diane found a vase for the flowers, the four of them settled around a small table that Scott and Elena had recently brought in. They shared stories of the Foundation's new project, how more women were coming forward with their struggles, encouraged by Elena's public victory in court. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter, especially when April babbled loudly from her crib, as if announcing her own contentment. At one point, Elena stood, excusing herself to check on the baby. Diane's expression turned thoughtful. She looked at Scott. "I'm so proud of the changes you've helped spark. The staff at New Beginnings is bustling with energy we haven't seen in years." Scott glanced at the partially open door to the bedroom, where Elena cooed softly to April. "It's like I've found a new calling," he said quietly. "I used to think success was about building an empire that couldn't be toppled, but now I see success in smaller, simpler moments." Matteo nodded, tapping the table gently. "This place is small, and yet it feels like a palace compared to what Elena faced a few months ago." Diane's eyes flicked to Scott. "Any word from the board about your role?" He sighed. "They're biding their time. The encryption product is taking off, so shareholders are happy for now. Walter's still wary, but he doesn't have enough votes to force me out unless something drastic happens. It's a stalemate." Diane and Matteo exchanged relieved looks. "Well, that's something," Diane said. Elena returned, her face soft with maternal calm. She slipped back into her seat, glancing around at the three people who had become her lifeline. "I've been thinking," she began, voice gentle. "My parents want to see me and to meet April. They're still in Mexico, but if my asylum status allows, maybe they can come visit or even relocate eventually." Scott reached over and covered her hand with his. "Rachel's working on family reunification. We'll make it happen." Emotions welled in Elena's eyes. "I want to thank you all. Diane, Matteo, Scott. Without you, I don't know where I'd be. Possibly living in fear forever, or worse." Diane shook her head, a warm smile curling her lips. "We just gave you a boost. You did the rest yourself." After a simple dinner of sandwiches and fruit, they lingered, reluctant to end the evening. The conversation drifted to future dreams, how Elena might volunteer at the Foundation, how Matteo wanted to expand outreach in underserved neighborhoods, how Scott considered reshaping his company's philanthropic policies to help more immigrant families. Each idea felt like a new thread weaving them together. Eventually, Diane and Matteo departed, leaving Elena and Scott alone. The apartment had grown hushed. April slept peacefully in the next room, lulled by the low hum of a space heater. Elena locked the door, a firm twist of the deadbolt that symbolized her newfound sense of security. Tired but happy, they sank onto the small sofa, facing each other in the dim light of a single lamp. Elena fiddled with the hem of her sweater. "I keep expecting to wake up," she whispered, "like none of this is real." Scott brushed a stray hair from her face. "It's real. You're free to build the life you deserve." She lifted her gaze to his. "What about us? We lost 20 years. Where do we go from here?" He felt his throat tighten. Memories of teenage promises flooding back. Yet they were no longer kids in the Bronx. They were adults who had fought hard battles. "Let's take it one day at a time," he said softly. "We have our whole future to figure that out." A wave of emotion shimmered in her eyes. She leaned in, resting her head on his shoulder. They stayed like that, their breathing synchronizing, hearts full of gratitude and cautious hope. Outside, a lone car rumbled by, headlights flashing across the apartment wall like a fleeting reminder of the busy world beyond. But in that small sanctuary, time felt suspended, charged with the quiet triumph of two souls who had found each other again against all odds. As midnight approached, Elena stood to check on April one last time. Scott trailed behind, peeking into the bedroom. The baby slept soundly, tiny fingers curled around a worn plush rabbit, a gift from Diane. A profound peace settled in the air. Stepping away from the crib, Elena and Scott shared a look, a silent understanding that they had reached a new beginning, one shaped by empathy, courage, and the love that had survived decades apart. Whatever obstacles remained, corporate battles, lingering threats, or the complexities of healing would be met with the strength they now carried together. Yes, they had triumphed over wealth, fear, and the shadows of the past. And in that modest apartment in Queens, love, in all its quiet resilience, stood as the final shield. A shield not even millions in the bank could ever replace. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.